Sorry for the delay, everyone. We're going to start in just 2 more minutes or so. Just 1 or 2 more minutes. So I'm just going to give some introduction, and then we can go. Okay. Okay, everyone. We're all set. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Lauren Bartlett. I'm the Human Rights in the U.S. Program Director with the Center on Human Rights and Humanitarian Law at American University Washington College of Law. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm pleased to welcome you to our commemoration of the 20th anniversary of genocide in Rwanda. Just FYI, this event is being live webcast and also recorded. The recording will be available on our website later today or perhaps tomorrow. Just a little housekeeping. Bathrooms are straight out the back doors, straight ahead. There's internet available for you all who are here. There's little cards on the tables that will give you access to our wireless network. Thank you so much for joining us to mark the first day of 100 days of killings that occurred in Rwanda in 1994. Over 800,000 people were killed, mostly Tutsis, in the genocide. Today marks the anniversary of the first day of those killings. We join the international community, those in Kigali and all over the world, in making this anniversary to commemorate those who were killed and also those who survived. WCL is proud to be part of the events happening around the world and here in D.C. Commemorating the genocide in Rwanda is part of our legacy here at WCL to bring genocide and genocide prevention to the forefront of the minds of our students, faculty, and staff, as well as our friends and neighbors in D.C. In 2004, we marked this anniversary with a big event as well as tabling, which is going on all day downstairs on the first floor in our lobby. Please check out our Student Advisory Board's table downstairs for ribbons. We're wearing gray ribbons to mark today, fact sheets, videos, and more to mark the anniversary. The Student Advisory Board and others will be there all day today from 8 a.m. till 6 p.m. And speaking of the Student Advisory Board of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law, this is really their event. They came up with the idea, and they've put much time and energy into putting this event together and making it the success that it's going to be. Thank you, Whitney, Ann, Edwin, Chris, Sequoia, Drew, and Natalie. Many thanks also to the Center for Human Rights Assistant Director Melissa Del Aguila for providing guidance and for tabling all morning this morning. I would also like to thank Tanisha Santos of the special events, Joe Maloney and Brian Rapp of our technology department, as well as our speakers who are coming for being with us today. In terms of what's going to happen, Dean Grossman will provide some welcome and introductory remarks very briefly. Then we're going to have a solemn commemoration ceremony. And then we'll have a keynote address by Professor Diane Orntlicker. And then we'll move on to our sessions. We're having 3 sessions this afternoon. The first will be on the use of technology to prevent genocide. The second will be on financing genocide. The third will be on citizen action to prevent genocide. Should be a really interesting afternoon. We have a great lineup of speakers, some of which who are already here with us. We have bios for our speakers as well as agendas in the back. Please note that the bios have been updated, and the ones that have a gray header are the updated bios. So that all said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the Dean, and he's going to say some brief remarks. Dean Claudio Grossman is Professor in Law and Dean here at American University Washington College of Law. Dean Grossman is serving his 3rd term as chair of the United Nations Committee Against Torture, a position he has held since April 2008. And he has been a committee member since 2003. On May 20th, 2013, Dean Grossman was elected chair of the United Nations Human Rights Treaty Bodies for a one-year term. So thank you, Dean Grossman, for providing some welcome remarks.
Thanks, Lauren, and thanks all of you for being here. On behalf of our school, I welcome you to this important commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda. As Lauren said, today marks the 20th anniversary of the first day of 100 days in 1994, when genocide took place in Rwanda and over 800,000 people were killed, mostly Tutsis. Today we honor those who died and those who survived the genocide. We provide a space to ask probing questions about the current relevance of the Genocide Convention, recent developments in technology to prevent mass atrocities such as genocide, and how to take meaningful action to prevent genocide beyond military action, but also including humanitarian intervention when it is necessary. In 2004, our school hosted a major event commemorating the 10th anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda. Commemorating a genocide is nothing to celebrate because, of course, it means that the genocide took place. And we belong to a generation that thought that after the Second World we will never see genocide event, and that shows the failure of the international community to prevent and react promptly against this crime against humanity. But we believe that it's important to remember, to learn from, and to do our part in striving to prevent such horrible atrocities from occurring in the future and in holding perpetrators of genocide accountable. We are here with the belief that this is something we can do, that the prevention of genocide is not some ideal dream that cannot simply take place. It depends on all of us, on our ability to mobilize, our ability to create institutions and procedures for prevention, for accountability, and our ability as individual citizens and persons to react and be with imagination and with commitment to create and imagine a world where this type of atrocities are not possible. Our conference today, the conference you have organized, will explore concrete ways in which that imagination of a world without genocide can be realized with the common effort of all of us. We do this in the context of our founder celebrations in our law school. We were created more than 100 years ago by two courageous women, when women were not allowed into legal education and into a practice of the profession. Also then, it was said that that was an impossible task. Women were deemed that they didn't have the analytical powers to practice law and practice the profession, and that's why they were not allowed. By nature, it was said. We always blame nature by our social constructs that are artificially made and create artificial barriers between individuals. Well, they were laughed at, and they thought at that time that this possibility was untenable. Look at what has happened since then. We have not yet achieved total equality between men and women, and there are numerous grounds for discrimination. But we have made progress, and in this own law school, almost 60% of the students are women. We can follow the example of our founding mothers, and with the same commitment and imagination, strive also for a world where genocide will not be possible. And as I said before, these things that appear non-attainable depends on our goodwill, effort, and commitment. So the event that has been organized today is another step into that direction. I would like to thank those who contributed to the realization of this important event. Our Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law, ably directed by Hadar Harris, the Center Students Advisory Board, Lauren Bartlett, who directs the Center's local human rights lawyering project, and the Center's co-sponsors of this event, the War Crimes Research Office, which was created to assist the ICTR, the International Legal Studies Program, and the K Spiritual Life Center for organizing, also for cooperating for the realization of this conference. We're also very proud of our students who not only organize these events, but are also traveling in the lobby, providing information and ribbons, and organize the art exhibit to commemorate the genocide in Rwanda. Our students are the best that we can offer. In spite of the pressures created by debt, by the rigor of the studies, by the uncertainties of the labor market, our students give us an example of commitment in taking on important issues to create a better world, like this one, the prevention of genocide. So my admiration for our students. It bodes well for the future of the legal profession, that we can attract students like you, that not only find the time, but make it a central part of their lives to engage the world, the community, the nation into these important endeavors. Well, we're honored to have also distinguished panelists, guest panelists here today, and I thank them for contributing to this important event. Well, the best is yet to come. We look forward to an exciting event, and thank you very much for this initiative. Thank you.
Okay, now we're going to start our solemn ceremony in just a moment, but I'm going to introduce first Joseph Eldridge, who's the university chaplain and senior adjunct professorial lecturer at the School of International Service up on main campus. Joe is a last-minute addition, so I'm sorry for not having his bio here, but thank you, Joe.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you all very much for coming. I think it is important always to remember. There's a collection, an anthology of poems called Against Forgetting. Lest we forget, we are put ourselves at great peril. I certainly agree with Dean Grossman and appreciate his words that genocide can be, must be prevented through institutions and structures. I was working for a non-governmental human rights organization in 1994 when the first signals of a genocide that were looming over the horizon became evident to us. The international community, rather than rushing in, rushed out. The international community left over the protestations, over the alarm that was registered by many people who saw this in slow motion beginning to take root, take hold. We're not strangers to genocide, honestly. I mean, when we think about our own country was in some ways born in a genocide, if you will, against the Native American, the Indian population. The 20th century was a bloody century. The Armenian genocide by the Ottoman Turks marked the first modern genocide, and in some ways the Rwandan genocide in 1994 was the, well, depending on what you call happening in Bosnia, they were bookends for a century of bloodletting, a century of tragedy. We're here to say, and you're here to say, we got to do something about this. The international community got to do something about this. We cannot allow this to stand. We cannot allow this to be the way we go about doing our business. And we look today at what's transpiring in Syria, and it utterly breaks our heart. So I want to congratulate you. I understand the students are responsible for organizing this. So to you, the students, on behalf of the Case Spiritual Life Center, this Interfaith Center, where we like to think that we are, our defining character is that of hospitality and welcome to everyone. I'm grateful that for you pulling this together. Dr. King said, who is one of my mentors and a figure who made me in some ways who I am, was because of Dr. King and who he was. He says, returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. The chain reaction of evil, hate begetting hate, wars producing more wars, must be broken, or we shall be plunged into the dark abyss of annihilation. And he also said that we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. What affects one of us directly affects us all indirectly. We cannot be who we can be until everyone else is who they should be. So it is that connectedness, that part of the bond of the human family that we have to preserve at all costs. And when it is broken, we're all broken. So again, my thanks to you, the students, for organizing this. I think it's critically important that, that we pause to honor and remember the victims and the survivors of the 100 days of genocide in Rwanda.
Good afternoon. My name is Sequoia Ayala, and I'm a member of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law's Student Advisory Board. In order to frame today's discussion, we decided that we wanted to show you all a short film put together by Quibica 20. This film highlights some of the experiences and perspectives of people affected by the genocide in Rwanda.
Sorry, we'll just skip ahead. Sorry, we can't play the video right now. It was working earlier. Well, maybe we'll just do the candle lighting in a moment, and then we'll try and play the video once we get it working again. We'll have to get it working because we'll have some more videos.
Okay, so at this time, we'd like to invite you all to observe a moment of silence, 100 seconds for the 100 days of violence that plagued Rwanda. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for everybody to coming to this event. It is an honor for me to have the opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Diane Ortlicker. Professor Ortlicker is an expert in international justice, international criminal law, and the law of genocide. Although it would take far too long to properly detail Professor Ortlicker's impressive professional history, I would like to highlight just a few reasons why we are honored to have her speak today. Here at Washington College of Law, Professor Ortlicker is a faculty co-director of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law and was fundamental in establishing the War Crimes Research Office. Beyond WCL, Professor Ortlicker twice worked as an independent expert for the United Nations, drafting reports related to combating impunity and protecting human rights. Most recently, Professor Ortlicker worked to develop the Obama administration's Atrocities Prevention Board during her time as the Deputy for War Crimes Issues at the U.S. State Department. Today, we remember the tragic events that took place in Rwanda 20 years ago and commemorate those who were lost when the sanctity of basic human rights was forgotten and ignored. Over the course of her career, Professor Ortlicker has made significant steps to ensure that this type of horrific tragedy never occurs again and our most basic rights are never again dismissed. Please join me in welcoming Professor Diane Ortlicker.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that wonderful introduction. It's an understatement to say that I'm honored to be invited to speak here. I'm so proud, although I had nothing to do with your initiative in organizing this, but I'm nonetheless so proud to be a professor at a law school where students who don't bear the burden of the Rwanda genocide the way my generation does, nonetheless recognize their own common humanity with the victims and honor their suffering in this way. So thank you for doing this, and thank you for inviting me to speak. I think our video may be ready now. As Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel has so eloquently reminded us and reminded us often, in his words, remembering is a noble and necessary act. To be sure, for those of us who were already adults 20 years ago, it's hard to feel noble as we remember the 800,000 Rwandans who were slaughtered in 100 nightmarish days and whom the world shamefully allowed to be slaughtered, although we knew what was happening. But we can and must honor their memory, which we carry in our hearts and in our conscience. In Wiesel's words again, although they suffered alone, they did not die alone. For something and all of us died with them. As Wiesel, my last quote of Elie Wiesel, also memorably wrote in his novel Night, and as Reverend Joe Eldridge and Dean Grossman noted earlier, we remember atrocities like the Holocaust that Wiesel survived, not only to honor the dead, although it's essential that we honor them, but also, in Wiesel's words, to warn the living that it could happen again and that it must never happen again. Yet, of course, for all the solemn vows after the Holocaust that it must never happen again, the crime of genocide happened again in Rwanda. Worse, and again, as Reverend Eldridge noted, not only did the United Nations fail to intervene to stop the genocide, but its principal response to the genocide was to draw down the peacekeeping force that was already in Rwanda, thereby sealing the fate of hundreds of thousands of defenseless people. The UN did this despite the urgent pleas of the UN peacekeeping force's courageous commander, one of my heroes, Romeo Dallaire, who sought reinforcements so that he could save more lives. With the skeletal force that remained, Dallaire was able to save thousands of lives, and imagine what he could have done if we had stood with him. While genocide was happening in Rwanda, ethnic cleansing was well underway and advancing in Bosnia, culminating in yet another eminently preventable genocide in Srebrenica in July 1995. The generation who came of age during both of those genocides vowed that we would carry in our conscience the memories of those we failed, and that going forward we would do what we could to shake governments out of indifference the next time we faced the specter of mass atrocities. We didn't have to wait long to be tested on this vow, and also, importantly, to discover, and here I'm echoing Dean Grossman's sentiment, that we actually could make a difference when we made it our business to try. In 1995, the United States and other countries finally intervened in Bosnia after some 8,000 Muslim men and boys were slaughtered in a few days' time in Srebrenica. And we quickly saw that our government had been just plain wrong for 3.5 years when they told us that the carnage in Bosnia was unstoppable. We applied the lessons of Bosnia a few years later when NATO intervened to halt atrocities in Kosovo. 3 years ago, the UN applied the lessons of Rwanda once again when it authorized an intervention to head off a bloodbath in Benghazi, Libya, whose residents had just been warned by Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, quote, "We are coming. We will find you in your closets and show no mercy." I was a State Department official when the UN Security Council authorized states to use all necessary means to protect civilians in Libya. And I can tell you that many in the Obama administration, myself included, were very profoundly mindful of our failures in Rwanda and in Bosnia. And we were determined not to allow another epic slaughter on our watch. But of course, we have to acknowledge what's obvious. The interventions to end atrocities in Bosnia, Kosovo, Libya, are cold comfort to those in Syria who justly feel the world has abandoned them to their unbearable fates. And how many of us can even describe the threats facing civilians in the Central African Republic, often called the forgotten crisis? Much less, how many of us could explain what we would like our own government leaders to do about it? What steps also have each of us taken to curb escalating violence in South Sudan, or to mobilize protection for the Rohingya in Myanmar, an ethnic group so persecuted that no state even recognizes them as citizens, and who now face a grave risk of genocidal violence if effective steps aren't taken to secure their safety? So behind each of those questions, what are we doing to respond to these crises, is a deeper one that really gets to the heart of what I think this memorial is all about. So the deeper question is, why, if we have found the will and a way to respond to some humanitarian crises, have we seen paralysis at best and indifference at worst in the face of so many others? And what can we do to change that now? So there's obviously no single answer to the first question, as each humanitarian crisis presents its own unique challenges. But a few themes figure perennially in the internal deliberations of governments and in the views of those who shape public attitudes. And they include the following. And I'm sure you've heard these all many times. Number one, this conflict is too complex for us to be able to make a meaningful contribution. Even if we were to intervene, we have no assurance we won't end up with a situation that's even worse. How often have we heard this argument made sincerely about Syria in recent years? And when I say sincerely, I mean by human rights advocates and others. A closely related argument that continually recurs, an argument for inaction, is the view that nothing we might do would actually stop the violence. We heard this time and again throughout the 3.5-year siege of Sarajevo and ethnic cleansing throughout Bosnia. But when NATO forces finally intervened after the Srebrenica slaughter, we realized it wasn't so hard, after all, to deter further atrocities. The self-defeating argument that we're helpless to effect change seemed so compelling as the body count mounted in Rwanda that few voices even argued for military intervention there. It's really hard to remember and believe that, but there wasn't a groundswell of calls for intervention in Rwanda as the genocide proceeded. Yet Romeo Dallaire showed the world that his forces could save lives with the all too meager resources we left him. He saved thousands of lives. Today, no one doubts that we could have saved countless more lives if we had answered Dallaire's calls for more troops. So to my mind, one of the most important lessons of Rwanda is that we should fiercely resist the dangerously seductive case for complacency, the argument that we're powerless to stop atrocities in their tracks. And finally, In situations where violence against civilians has escalated to a point that can be stopped only by military action, we often hear this justification, certainly in the United States and I'm sure also in other countries. Our version, the American public has no appetite for another intervention. They just don't see why it's got to be their responsibility to end atrocities in every region. Now, I don't want to suggest that any of these arguments is specious. Indeed, particularly in some contexts, they can be quite compelling. Though I would add that it's important that these arguments be the beginning and not the end of public debate and a search for solutions. Fortunately, too, as you'll hear this afternoon, we have developed increasingly sophisticated tools to enable those at risk of grave violence to address those at risk in the early stages of the trajectory of violence, lowering the costs and increasing the chances that we will be successful in our efforts to stop an escalation of violence if we act in a timely fashion. Going back to the concerns, though, that I mentioned, and again, I'm sure you've all heard them in recent years alone, however valid those concerns may be in any particular context, when we repeatedly hear these arguments for indifference, they have a cumulative effect that deeply concerns me. Their frequent repetition helps inure us to atrocities, to violence whose victims we may, on some future anniversary, be remembering in solemn ceremonies like this one. And it's that development of callousness about atrocities elsewhere in the world that in some ways worries me the most and helps explain why I'm so proud of you for challenging that indifference. As you have probably guessed from my previous remarks and from Dean Grossman's, to those of you who are still students, and I think that's most of you here, I want you to know you can change the dynamics of indifference. You can. And here I really am speaking as a former U.S. government official. The young people who made the half-hour video Coney 2012 a few years ago changed the dynamic about U.S. efforts to capture Joseph Kony, who's terrorized countless children in East Africa for over 20 years. One video helped reinvigorate U.S. efforts to end Kony's reign of terror. Don't doubt that you can make a difference, too. Coney 2012 has a clip in which the filmmaker who produced the video is speaking to an audience of students. And he asks rhetorically, "Who are you to end a war?" And he answers his own question, "Who are you not to?" Samantha Power's extraordinary book about how policymakers have responded to genocides in the past century, A Problem from Hell. How many of you have read any of this or heard? Yeah? Wonderful book, and I seriously encourage you to read any part of it. One chapter will have a profound impact. So this book has an incisive analysis of the factors that contributed to the United States' shameful insistence that UN forces all but fully withdraw from Rwanda rather than stay and save lives during the genocide. So I want to read you just a brief passage from the book that proverbially says it all. So first, Samantha Power summarizes some of the myriad considerations that added up to and accounted for inaction inside the Clinton administration during the genocide. And then she writes, but as was true with previous genocides, U.S. officials were making potent political calculations about what the U.S. public would abide. As always, they looked to op-ed pages of elite journals, popular protest, and congressional noise to gauge public interest. No group or groups in the United States made Clinton decision-makers feel or fear that they would pay a political price for doing nothing to save Rwandans. Only after the genocide would it become possible to identify an American constituency for action. During the 3-month genocide in Rwanda, the op-ed pages of America's newspapers were silent, ignorant, and prone fatalistically to accept the futility of outside intervention. The phones in congressional offices were not ringing. Power goes on to write that in a meeting between representatives of Human Rights Watch and then National Security Advisor Tony Lake on April 21st, 1994, Lake told the Human Rights Watch advocates, quote, "If you want to make this move, that is, make the United States government move to do something in Rwanda, you will have to change public opinion. You must make more noise. But, Power wrote, the only noise that could be heard was the sound of machetes slicing their way through Rwanda's Tutsi population. So my plea to you and my encouragement to you is to make noise when you learn that large numbers of civilians are at grave risk or are already suffering horrific atrocities. Don't stop yourselves before you even try to make a difference by believing the all too conventional wisdom in Washington that no one seriously believes we can or should take this challenge on, as we hear time and again. Last night, a friend of mine who used to work for the Dalai Lama told me about a conversation the two of them had when the Dalai Lama asked my friend to move to Washington to be his U.S. policy director. My friend's response was a polite version of, no way. No one in Washington can possibly be moved to care about Tibet. The Dalai Lama replied, the effort with right motivation is always worthwhile. I'm looking to Joe because I know Martin Luther King has a very similar quote, very powerful, along the same lines. So when you ever doubt that you can make a difference in marshaling an effective response to a complex humanitarian crisis, remember the Dalai Lama's wise counsel. The effort with the right motivation is always worthwhile. In closing, I want to say that we also have unfinished work to do at home in addressing our own more direct responsibility for grave human rights violations that should never have happened. As many of you know, last week the Senate Intelligence Committee voted to make public the key findings of its investigation into the CIA's use of torture in the post-9/11 years. In the words of the committee's chair, Senator Dianne Feinstein, the purpose of this review was to uncover the facts behind this secret program, and the results were shocking. The report exposes brutality that stands in stark contrast to our values as a nation. It chronicles a stain on our history that must never again be allowed to happen. That's Senator Feinstein's words. For those of you who are fortunate enough to have a senator, I don't, I live in Washington, write him or her and let them know how important you think it is that we as a nation come clean about this dark stain on our history. Vice President Biden has already called for the Senate committee's report to be made public. He's noted the central importance to any society that has committed or been responsible for serious violations of fundamental rights to come clean, to come to terms with its past. We need to let President Obama know, too, how important we believe it is that he support the Senate committee's request to declassify its investigation. And again, as a former U.S. policymaker, I can tell you that this is important not only for its own sake, but because other countries whom we try to persuade to stop atrocities against their own citizens tell us often, what have you done to address the violations of your own past? So in closing, I want to return to Anthony Lake's comments to the Human Rights Watch representatives who visited him as the genocide mounted in Rwanda. In the midst of that violence, he said, you must make more noise. So keep making noise. It's heard. Thank you for doing this and for including me in this important event.
Thank you, Professor Ortlicker, for your very moving remarks. I was sitting in the back of the room. I figured I would speak because they would figure out the film while I was speaking, and I'm the least important person speaking today. My name's Hadar Harris. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. I have to say how moved I was, because in 1994, I was a law student at UCLA Law School. And I sat and I watched TV, and I saw just a glimpse of what was going on, because it was not well reported, but it was very clear what was happening in Rwanda. It was very clear what was going on and what was happening. And so there was a little inkling in the editorial pages, because I wrote a letter to the editor of the LA Times, which was published while I was in law school, basically calling for the international community to do something, but identifying the fact that there were no TV cameras really paying attention to what was going on in Rwanda. There were no oil interests. Even back at that point, we realized that that had a linkage between intervention, and that it was incumbent on the international community to do something to stop the slaughter. It was this time of year. It was finals for me in law school. So it was a good diversion because I didn't have to study, and instead was really concerned by what was going on. But I would say, and again, kind of reinforce your and our responsibilities. I'm asked repeatedly, well, what would you do to stop genocide or mass atrocity? And how do you think that that gets stopped? And I said, I think you have to want to stop it. I think that there are lots of ways to stop it. But this idea of us as individuals and collectively taking responsibility to push policymakers to take action to be able to stop it is what the rest of this afternoon is going to talk about. So with that filler, I want to thank, again, Professor Orntlicher, and I really want to thank so deeply the Student Advisory Board for all of the work that they've done in putting today's events together. We want to show this short video to give you a little bit more context for what we really are talking about. We assume that people know what happened in Rwanda. We know that that is no longer true today. And so we hope that through this very short 4-minute video, we will provide a context within the discussions up to now. We'll sit and we'll provide fodder for the next part of our day today. Thank you.
bavugije induru basakuza cyane bavuga ko bamuvumbuye ni gutyo bavugaga ko bagiye nyine kumwica ko ari inyenzi
gukora ibikorwa bibi twakoreye ahangaha tukahaburira tukayicira abantu b'inshuti twasangiraga tukabicira inzirakarengane ntacyo twapfaga.
We looked around us and smelled and saw. We realized that we were in the midst of a genocide.
The genocide in Rwanda in 1994 was a planned and political campaign. It came from a racist ideology called Hutu power.
Ça recommence à 94, c'est ce qui s'est passé à 59, les années 60, les années 70.
kirigishwa kigira izindi mbaraga ari nazo zashenye igihugu. Umugabo ngo ndamushaka ngo kandi nje mbizi ko hari mwimakanira maze gufungira abakobwa bafungira mu byuma byabo abamama bakuru babafungira mu byuma byabo
kuko nibwo umuryango wanjye washize nta n'icyanyibageza uwo munsi.
On a vraiment voulu nous exterminer, on a voulu vraiment effacer toute trace que nous avons existé.
Isesero ni akarere gafite amateka katuwe kuva kera n'abatutsi. Imisozi yose mureba baje barahahurira kugira ngo barebe uburyo bakwirwanaho.
Atita kuko ndi umututsi ahubwo yumva ko agomba gukiza ubuzima bwanjye.
The young man and young lady who were working in our home were marked to be killed. What would you have done? Are you just going to say, well, good luck, I'll pray for you?
Nyuma kwibuka ari ngombwa kuko uramutse utibutse nta nubwo ubasha kumenya.
Nous, quand nous nous souvenons, nous les reformons, nous les ramenons en vie.
Ils ne sont plus là, mais ils ne sont pas morts, ils sont en moi. Ils vivent pas moi.
bakanditse babikorewe bagomba kubyibuka cyinshi kugira ngo babyigishe
kugira ngo n'abana bacu nabo bazabimenye babibwirizwe ntibazongere kugwa mu mutego abantu bahuye.
Thanks to the people that really managed to liberate, because I wouldn't be here.
The body of Rwanda was tortured, was assaulted. The body succumbed, but the spirit never did.
Imyaka 20 irashize, icyizere kandi kirahari.
Ukabona ubu ngubu uburyo igihugu kiyubatse njye mbyita mu gahe gato cyane. tubasha kubana n'abantu bose amahoro bana batugire nabi tubasha gusanga tugasangira
ye barasabana barashyingirana ubona nta bwishishanyo bukiri hagati y'abantu.
Icyizere kirahari cyinshi, haba nahera ku giti cyanjye kuri njyewe nabaye umuprofesiyoneri wa mbere mu bijyanye no gutwara amagare.
icyo nababwira cyane cyane abana ntibazapfusha ubusa amahirwe bagize yo kuvukira mu gihugu gishaka amahoro umutekano kuri bose.
Le futur est bon et on doit y tenir, et surtout pour nos enfants et surtout pour les générations.
C'est ma raison de vivre. C'est ma raison de vivre, Kimuka.
Okay, everyone, so thank you so much. Sorry that that didn't work out so we could have the moment for silence after the video, but we're going to move on to our first session of the afternoon. We're just going to have our speakers come up and go right into it. So just give us a couple of minutes because two of our speakers are coming in via Google Hangout, so we just need to get them online and all set, and we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you. This will be the clicker. It'll show up back there. Maybe we can get it to come right here right now.
That's fine. Yeah. I'll just keep an eye back here. And it's just like next.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sign this document. Yeah, right. Right. She getting there. She had to have basically destroyed her shoulder and a wipe out and had to have it rebuilt. Just now sitting at home. Yeah, yeah. Thanks. How have you been traveling a lot?
Yeah, a couple months or so.
Right. I guess we'll hear more about how that's going in a minute.
Sure.
Okay.
How about you?
All right.
You're at the Holocaust Museum?
Yeah, I mean, I'm working as a consultant to the Center for Prevention of Genocide there, but not on staff.
Okay.
I'm still doing bits and pieces of other things. But that's most of what I'm doing on the thing I'll talk about.
Yeah.
Hi. Nice to meet you. Thanks. Uh-huh. Sure. Yeah, Oldfelder. Yep. Okay.
It's just at KV Strip. I was able to find everyone.
Yeah,
yeah. Thanks.
Cheers.
You stay involved with the PITF much?
Not I mean, like I'm like kibitzing on the work they're doing occasionally, but not deeply involved in it at this point. Yeah. Are you just curious?
Yeah, I'm always interested in the work that they're doing.
Yeah. I think they're trying to start trying to kind of start a new round of modeling for a while, and it's sort of circling around, trying to decide what to be doing with that. Were either of you at that Build Peace thing over the weekend in Cambridge? I know Chris was, but it's probably part of why he's not here. Yeah. Yeah.
Scott Edwards.
Yeah.
Yeah, he said I need to talk to you about Nigeria.
Yeah, that'd be great.
We've been doing a lot of work on it.
Oh, that's true.
Trying to document stuff, the detentions.
Oh, wow.
Right. Yeah. That's the part. You were.
So difficult.
Yeah, right. That,
like shops.
Right.
How do we?
Right.
I mean, we have photos from the war.
Yeah.
Images.
Right.
And then both of them.
Right. Boy. Yeah, that's a thorny problem.
It is really terrible.
Yeah, because it's
Crashed, the one that was connected to the screen, so we may not have a screen.
But that seems like, and I think it was mostly through some of the reporting you all were doing last year, that we were more aware of what was going on from the state security forces, reaching a pretty substantial scale as well, but that's not really getting talked about, the sort of indiscriminate and I mean, it seems like right now it's just spiraling. Yeah. Right, and then business with escape or whatever, and just kill everybody, hundreds of people.
So sorry, everybody. Just give us one more minute, and hopefully we can get this working again. Katie is going first, and I think we can get it working.
Do you want to use my laptop?
It looks like it's working. We have a backup laptop.
Oh, okay. I mean, if you need mine, you're welcome to. Technology.
You always jinx yourself.
Totally.
The irony here.
Regardless of how set up you can be, something always doesn't work.
If on the technology panel.
Yeah.
It's not the solution.
We'd be fine if we were just doing it on our phones. That would work. It's like trying to.
You both are based in Washington?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you not?
I'm based in Washington.
Okay, yeah.
Have you been out to Nigeria?
No. Hopefully at some point in the next few months.
Okay. Where are you planning on going?
The northern states.
Which one?
We're doing a lot of work in Maiduguri. So there, the security situation now is kind of making it nearly impossible for someone like me to go. But we'll see.
Yeah.
I've been doing a lot of work in Mexico, actually.
Yeah, I haven't been up to Maiduguri. The farthest north I've been lately is Kaduna and Jos.
And for the security situation.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't. Usually when we have workshops, we bring folks down to a sort of a central location.
Yeah.
And Kaduna, Jos isn't it's certainly a hot spot on the map, but it's just not anything close to what you're seeing up in Borno State.
Yeah.
So.
It's getting really bad. You saw the report that we just put out a few
Yeah,
days ago.
it's terrible. I mean, if you look at the number of incidences, it's actually lower than it has been in 6 months ago.
Yeah.
But the level of lethality is so high right now.
Yeah. And just the lack of action and no one, the whole community is not really paying attention to what's going on. We've been trying for like 2 years to really get this on books radar. You know, we have the allies that stay in DFD, but there are other challenges.
I'm glad I just didn't do a presentation. I was just going to talk. Oh, yeah. Forget the slides. We're asymptotically approaching having a functioning website. So
Okay.
that would be the face of this project. It's supposed to be ready early this year. It was supposed to be around now. Now we're looking at the summer probably.
Websites are tough.
Yeah.
It's always more complicated than you think.
Yeah. Well, and we did this thing, we kind of hit a fork in the road last fall, or not fall, like summer of, we were initially going to hire a firm to do it, and then through a partnership we have as part of the project with Dartmouth, and this new lab was getting set up there, and they offered to do work and have done a bunch of work, and it's good work, but they're on more of a sort of academic schedule. It's taken longer and didn't quite get all the way to, so it was like, sort of, okay, did we go ahead with the paying for it? And they've been doing it as an in-kind donation to the project, so it was hard to turn that down. It has meant, doing things on a track where you're working with people who you're not paying and are on an academic calendar and all that is very different than having a contract.
You have a contract.
Yes, no, that's right. Yeah, it's not a guarantee. It's a guarantee you don't have to pay them necessarily everything you said, but not a guarantee that the work will get done.
But then if they eventually do it, then you have to think, well, do we pay them for...
Right, yeah.
My tendency is just to pay.
Right.
Even if it wasn't on the right
Yeah,
schedule.
you don't want to be a complete... Yeah. To watch the time I have to leave in time to pick my kids up.
Oh, really? How old are your kids?
14 and 11.
Mine are 6 and 3.
Oh yeah. Same difference in age. What are they? Boys, girls?
Yeah, 2 boys.
2 boys, same thing. Yeah. How are they getting along?
They get along great, although they seem to have hit like a half step off of each other. That's
right.
like last month or so.
Uh-huh.
So I think it's like developmentally they just kind of like hit like a rough patch.
Yeah, right.
Normally they get along.
Yeah.
That's good. Okay, everybody. We fixed it. Sorry for all of our technical difficulties. I think that we've got it figured out. We're going to go ahead and start our introductions. We had a crashed computer and then failed thumb drive, but looks like it is all working. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel and get us started, and then Katie will jump in since she's our first speaker. But we're starting the afternoon session, and as Hadar talked about briefly right after Professor Diane Ortlaker finished her notes, our afternoon discussion is going to focus on sort of really interesting, unique twists on genocide in Rwanda. And our first panel is really interesting in that we're going to be discussing the use of technology in preventing and documenting genocide. And if all of you remember, technology played a key role in the genocide in Rwanda when we think about the radio and inciting genocide, and that's actually nothing to do with our conversation today. Today we're going to be talking about current technologies, and we have 5 speakers talking about different technologies that they use and how they use the technologies to prevent and document mass atrocities happening around the world today. And I think this is going to be really interesting. We have a genocide forecaster. We're going to talk about human rights abuse documentation, and also a little bit about building movements. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists really briefly. Their bios are online and also available in the back of the room. So I'm just going to provide the briefest of bios for each of them before they speak. So first we're going to have Catherine Ciuffalino. Catherine is currently the Advocate and Science Human Rights Project Coordinator for Amnesty International's Crisis Prevention and Response Unit based in Washington, D.C. She conducts research, advocacy, capacity building, and manages projects primarily on armed conflict and urgent human rights developments globally, with an emphasis on leveraging scientific progress and technology for human rights protection. So thank you, Catherine, for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Lauren, and thanks especially to AU's Washington College of Law for putting on this commemoration. And I heard that the Student Advisory Board were the main organizers behind this, so great job, everyone. The Rwandan genocide is something we will never, ever forget, and it still impacts generations of individuals who are still seeking the answer as to why the atrocities occurred, and why the international community failed to intervene appropriately. My child was with me on my back, but because we had been found, we were told to lie on our fronts. My child was hit by a nail-studded club and was killed. I was hit as well, but I was left for dead. When I regained consciousness, I carried on. That is an excerpt from the testimony of Violet Mukabutera, a Hutu woman from southern Rwanda and a survivor of an attempted extrajudicial execution. She was formerly a resident of Kigali and had been hiding in the Butere with many others after the Rwandese Patriotic Army took control of the area. When Violet and those hiding with her heard that the RPA had taken control of the area and stopped killings, they slowly started to return home, and in fact turned themselves over to the RPA, at which time they were detained and taken to a screening center. On her 3rd day there, her husband was taken away. A man who had been taken away with her husband returned. He managed to escape and return back and reported that her husband and those that had been taken along with her husband had been tied up, hit on the head, and killed, and that their corpses were thrown into a river nearby. Violet tried to escape with her 13-month-old child strapped to her back, but was recaptured along with 2 other women. The 2 other women were killed by blows to the head, as was Violet's child. Violet was also hit on the head by a nail-studded club and survived, yet was left for dead. This is how she managed to escape. The Rwandan genocide was detected early on by reports of bodies, such as the bodies of Violet's husband, floating down rivers. While there were no cell phones available at the time, reporters were still able to get in and photograph some of the atrocities that were happening. So eventually the stories got out and were published in newspapers. Rwanda at the time had very poor technological infrastructure, and in many parts of the country still does today. Amnesty International, along with many other human rights organizations seeking to document the atrocities at the time, relied heavily on the collection of testimony from refugees who had managed to flee the country, and to whom our researchers had access to. The reports coming out from the press, who had geographic access, and various information from ground networks that we had developed since our inception in 1961. Pen and paper was the primary method for documenting this testimony. It was then sent back to headquarters to be synthesized, further analyzed, and released in a report or an action alert for our membership. The relative lack of the information at the time was a hindrance for 3 reasons. 1, for forecasting the genocide, which some of our colleagues here will probably talk a little bit more, for deterrent efforts. 2, for documenting and publicizing the extent of the atrocities as they were occurring to compel early response efforts. And 3, for justice and redress efforts afterward. Generally speaking, at the time, lack of systematic data collection for human rights crimes was nearly impossible, and the dissemination of collected data was slow and very clunky. Through the collection of testimonies such as Violet's from ground research, interviews with local monitoring organizations and government officials, as well as reviewing and triangulating the information that was coming out through various news sources, human rights organizations such as Amnesty International were able to expose and document atrocities such as the genocide in Rwanda and deem it as such for judicial efforts. Frankly, however, the information flow could pretty much be equated to a carrier pigeon. Also, precisely 20 years ago, in 1994 was in no way ironically the year IBM released its first smartphone, the Simon Personal Communicator. There we go. It retailed for $1,100 without a contract. Now fast forward to 1999, the year which marked the end of the armed conflict in Kosovo, a conflict which included the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Even though the first smartphone had been on the market for 5 years, simple mobile feature phones, like the clunky flip phones that we all had at one point, weren't yet integrated into regular humanitarian and human rights operational efforts on the ground, especially in armed conflict situations and in areas where there were very poor technological infrastructure. Satellite phones, pen and paper for documentation, and trusted networks to communicate information back to headquarters still remained one of the primary methods of information dissemination regarding the documentation of crimes at the time. Speaking of satellites, 1999 marked the year the first commercial high-resolution satellite sensor was launched, which looks kind of like that. This meant that anyone could buy a high-resolution satellite image if that sensor happened to be orbiting over the swath of Earth at the time the person wanted to purchase the image of. In 2002, the first camera phone was released by Sanyo. It was also the year that the Gujarat riots happened in India, which resulted in the killing of at least 2,000 women, men, and children, mostly Muslims, and the rape of a significant number of women and girls in the western Indian state. The documentation and dissemination of information relied still very much on poor technological infrastructure, though slightly better than what we saw in Kosovo 3 years prior. The events in Gujarat were the first instance of communal violence in India in the age of 24-hour news coverage that were televised worldwide, and this media coverage played a central role in the politics of the situation. The Editorial Guild of India rejected the charge. The graphic news coverage aggravated the situation, saying that the coverage exposed the horrors of the riots as well as the supine, if not complicit, attitude of the state, helping to propel remedial action. Back in the United States, the same year the Gujarat riots occurred, I had received for Christmas, there was the Gujarat riots, I had received for Christmas my very first Nokia phone. Some of you all may remember these. You could flip off the covers and change the color depending on what you fancy. It was relatively inexpensive with a cell phone plan and becoming fairly common amongst populations with solid technological infrastructure such as those that we had in the United States in 2002. But these were definitely not common in geographies such as Rwanda, Kosovo, and the western Indian state of Gujarat. Now onward to 2003, when the government of Sudan responded to a rebellion in the Darfur region and began a genocidal campaign against civilians, killing over 300,000 people and displacing over 3 million Darfuris. The terrain in Sudan, as many of you know, is literally brutal, vast desert and grave insecurity, making geographic access to the region of Darfur nearly impossible for researchers seeking to document the atrocities that were occurring. Technological infrastructure barely existed, and I'd equivocate telecommunications to smoke signals. Smoke signals from the homes that were being systematically burned to the ground by the government of Sudan. Which brings me to 2006, when Amnesty International, in collaboration with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, realized the full potential of how commercially available satellite imagery could drastically change the field of human rights protection, both for deterrence of crimes such as genocide and crimes against humanity, but also for irrefutable documentation. Those smoke signals from the burned and destroyed villages were now being monitored from satellites in the sky via the Eyes on Darfur project. And that's just a screenshot of what the project itself was. This unimpeachable evidence provided by high-resolution satellite imagery of the atrocities being perpetrated in Darfur, enabled action by private citizens, policymakers, and international courts. The Eyes on Darfur project broke new ground in both technology and the human rights protection field, and for the first time ever allowed people around the world to literally watch over and protect 12 intact yet highly vulnerable villages. It also broke new grounds in the context of GIS-derived data for use in judicial proceedings. The imagery and analysis provided by Amnesty and AAAS was cited in the ICC's Office of the Prosecutor's application for arrest warrants on crimes against humanity and genocide in Darfur. Again, the first time this type of evidence had been cited by an international court. Which brings me to today and the conflicts in Syria and the Central African Republic, during which crimes against humanity are occurring as we speak right now. While both Syria and CAR are different types of conflicts, occurring in vastly different geographies, technology has been used uniquely to disseminate near to real-time information to the global community, assist in documentation efforts, as well as the mass exposition in crimes. In Syria, citizens submitted videos and photos flooded our computer, since even prior to the onset of the official armed conflict, because of fairly sound technological infrastructure in the country and access to the internet by citizens. The influx of data, the huge influx of data, opened up new questions for our team at Amnesty International. How do we leverage this flood of data for human rights protection? Previously, such as during the Rwandan genocide, information was very hard to come by. Now, during the Syrian conflict, it's quite the opposite. We are facing information overload. We are, however, seeing a gap, which is becoming larger by the day. While those that are most materially disadvantaged, such as communities living in environments with very poor technological infrastructure, are better protected than in the past, the inequality of the vulnerable still exists. If the Rwandan genocide were occurring today, similar to what's happening in CAR in Syria, due to the technological advances I have laid out, it's reasonable to wonder if the atrocities would have persisted for as long and on the scale they did back in 1994. Amnesty International would have been able to use satellite imagery to document crimes, and citizens who had access to the internet and a camera phone would have been able to provide near to real-time information to the public. It would not have taken photos of bodies floating down a river published in a newspaper for the global community to learn about the atrocities occurring. And I would wager judicial proceedings would have, to hold the perpetrators of the genocide responsible, would have moved much faster than they did, because the evidence would have been much more compelling and much more readily available. Amnesty International sees these new technologies and data streams, such as GIS and citizen-derived data, such as YouTube videos and photos sent over Twitter, as a way to act as an early warning to propel deterrent efforts, as well as to feed into justice mechanisms. These technologies are part of the future of atrocity prevention. So at some point, we do not experience another Rwanda, another Kosovo, another Gujarat, another Syria, or another Central African Republic. And so people like Violet Mukabutera could have led a full life in Kigali with her husband and her child. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katie. Well, it looks like our computer crashed just when you finished, so good timing. We got through your presentation. Next, I'm going to have Jay Ulfelder go ahead. Jay is a genocide forecaster. His background in political science, and he theorizes and forecasts political development and instability in various forms, including democratization, coups, mass atrocities, civil unrest, and state collapse. Since the start of 2011, he's made a living as an independent consultant doing freelance project work for various clients. And for the 10 years before that, he worked for Science Applications International Corporation. Jay, go ahead.
Would you rather I come over there?
Either way. If you push, your microphone is on.
Okay, I'll just stay here then. Okay. My name's Jay Ulfelder, and what I want to talk about today is a new global atrocities early warning system. This is a project that's been in the works for about 2 years now, and hopefully will make its public debut later this year, hopefully this summer. if we can get our website up and running by then, a familiar problem. The project's a collaborative effort. It's being led by the Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. We're working in partnership with the Dickey Center for International Understanding and the Digital Arts Leadership and Innovation, or DALI Lab, both at Dartmouth College. And we've also gotten generous funding from Humanity United, among others, so far. The premise of the project's simple. Better early warning enables better preventive action. It's not that early warning guarantees successful prevention, but the earlier and more accurate our anticipatory efforts are, the more opportunities we create to prevent or at least mitigate mass atrocities. And so that's what we see our project doing. When we talk about technology, I think we usually picture, gadgets or devices, things like smartphones, jetpacks, robots, flying cars. Technology, more generally, though, is really about the application of knowledge to solve practical problems. And those applications can come in lots of different forms. The technologies at the core of our project are about ways to collect, create, and disseminate information. Some of the technologies we're using in the project are kind of new, so things like the internet. There's a particular machine learning algorithm we're using as part of the statistical work I'll talk about in a minute. And also a method for eliciting and aggregating expert judgments for forecasting, something called an opinion pool. So those are all kind of new. But really, what's innovative about our project isn't the technologies themselves so much as the idea of applying them to the problem of trying to anticipate mass atrocities. I think if you talk to people who work in this field, you might hear or get the sense that early warning isn't really the issue. It's already being done widely and well. We're doing that. That's not the concern. Actually, the whole premise of our project is that we disagree with that. A lot of what we have now really are sort of ad hoc alerts sounded in response to incipient violence. So you see atrocities beginning to occur somewhere and say, this place is obviously at risk of these things getting worse, and that's true. But it's not the only way to think about trying to anticipate these issues. When organizations are trying to look further into the future, they're usually relying on the judgment of individual experts, or sometimes doing a kind of more informal, get a group of people around a table, discuss it, and decide which places are at greatest risk. But what we know from research on forecasting across lots of different fields that those are not effective ways to do forecasting. You just don't get very accurate forecasts from those kinds of processes. So what we're trying to do really is do this task better by building a system that focuses explicitly on mass atrocities, not conflict more generically, that tries to look as far into the future as we can, that does that by using the best available methods for forecasting in particular, and then makes its findings available to the public, to all takers. And that last part's really important. There are governments that are doing some parts of this, but they hold that information closely. That information is not shared with the advocacy community, with people in the societies that are at risk of the kinds of things we're trying to forecast. The face of this project, of course, is going to be a public website. The DALI Lab at Dartmouth has already built a prototype of this for us. But the actual system itself has a couple of major modules or subsystems, and I'll talk a little bit about those. The first involves statistical assessments of the risk of onsets of state-led mass killing in countries worldwide. And what we're really trying to do here is spot surprises. So countries that appear to be at substantially higher risk or possibly lower risk than the conventional wisdom would hold, to try to start conversations about them. To generate these assessments, we're using a collection of statistical models representing a few different ideas about the origins of mass atrocities. All of these models are estimated from historical data, so we're comparing cases where these things happened to ones where they didn't. Basically looking to the recent past to try to identify patterns that will help us spot cases at high risk now. And I want to clarify, this isn't like big data, new data kind of stuff. We're actually using what would be relatively small data, people making judgments about characteristics of political regimes and politics, as well as socioeconomic kinds of indicators in countries. But again, this is kind of these aren't new techniques. Again, it's using statistical techniques that have been around for a while and just applying them to this area. We're not, again, using a single model. We're using a collection. We average the forecast across a few models. We're doing this because we know from other fields, weather forecasting and also elections forecasting, so the sort of model of models approach that people like Nate Silver used in the last election, that you're generally going to get a more accurate forecast from this averaging approach than you will from a single model. This is because, you sort of learn from all the perspectives and sort of hedge against the biases inherent in any one of them. So that, again, this is an existing technology and existing data largely that we're just applying to an area where it hasn't been applied so much in the past. The website we're building will let users sort of poke around in those assessments, see how they're changing over time, and also compare the forecasts across the models from that ensemble, so you can get a sense of what different sort of theories about the origins might suggest differently about a particular case. We're also eventually at least planning to make that interactive so users can manipulate the inputs to the models and get a sense of how changes in the risk factors over time might, suggest different future scenarios, how risk might be changing, from the present as politics evolves in particular cases. Also, to help us sort of catch and fix errors in the, in this big statistical contraption we're building, we're sharing all the data and code used in the statistical modeling on an open site called GitHub. This is kind of in the spirit of open software like Linux and all that, and hoping that interested researchers are going to poke around in this, again, help us catch errors, but also help us identify additional models and do it better. So that's the first piece, is the statistical risk assessment. The other major forecasting piece is a wisdom of expert crowd system. We know from prior research, again, on forecasting, that individual experts are often pretty poor forecasters of events like these. They generally don't do much better than chance. But it turns out that crowds of experts are actually pretty good at this. So we're trying to take advantage of that principle by running a system called an opinion pool on a platform built by a company called Inkling Markets. They're not the only ones who do this, but they've kindly donated their platform to us for now. In an opinion pool, maybe some of you have seen prediction markets. An opinion pool is a lot like that, except here, instead of trading as the mechanism, you just ask people to directly make forecasts and then aggregate those. And then, so people register for this, and then they log in, pick which questions they want to answer, and then simply tell us how likely they think the relevant event is by moving a slider from 0 to 100% on the page. The really important part, though, is that whenever the people change their minds about how likely they think something is, they read or see or hear some new information, and that changes their belief, they can log back in, update that forecast, and the aggregate forecast updates immediately with it. So what the public will see is then the average of all the inputs on any one question and how that's changing over time. It's a crude analogy in the circumstances, but kind of like a stock ticker, you could see how the experts' pooled beliefs are changing as events change on the ground. Now, the larger and more diverse this pool of experts becomes, the more accurate our forecast should be. So we're really aiming to recruit participants in this opinion pool from all around the world. We're also trying to develop at this point a third sort of subsystem or module, moving away from forecasting into monitoring, where we try to take advantage of new machine-coded event data to monitor global press coverage of atrocities in near real time. So now actually trying to watch at reporting of atrocities rather than the forecasting part. This isn't going to be part of the initial system, but we're hoping to have it up and running later this year, early next. And then last but not least, the website will also feature a blog that we really see as a critical part of the early warning task here. We're not just going to kind of toss the forecast over the transom, assume people, can interpret it on their own and are tracking what we're doing. Instead, we're really planning to use the blog and then social media in conjunction with that to do things like drawing attention to changes in the forecast if we see an uptick in what the experts are saying, or vice versa, to connect those to events in the news, and also to call out relevant new research by other people working in the same field. So that's the Atrocities Early Warning Project we're developing. Again, we're hoping to have this public website up within the next few months. And as I said before, we're not inventing any new technologies here. Instead, what we're really doing is bringing forecasting technologies that have been proven in other fields to the problem of atrocities early warning. And again, with the belief that better forecasting will sometimes enable more effective preventive action. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jay. Now we're going to test out our technology one more time. And obviously our technology is not as good as all the technology you guys are talking about because we can't even seem to. But hopefully we've got it. I'm going to be hopefully introducing Chris Tuckwood. No, he's not on there? Okay, maybe we will skip Chris. Nate, we'll go to you and we'll see if we can get Chris on. Nate Haken is a senior associate at the Fund for Peace. He directs the Conflict Early Warning and Assessment Program and leads the research behind the annual Fragile States Index. He facilitates local civil society networks in several conflict-affected countries for participatory assessment, early warning, and conflict prevention projects, including the Understanding Local Knowledge program. And his full bio is available online and in the back. Thank you. Yes, please.
Do you want the...
Here's the...
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this excellent event. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can use technology to empower people for conflict prevention purposes. As we've said, I think several times in different ways so far today, it's clear that technology alone by itself isn't going to prevent conflict from happening. It's a very useful tool, but it's not going to prevent genocide. Similarly, taking if technology is only in the hands of the technologists themselves, again, it's not really going to prevent genocide or conflict from happening. And One of the areas where there's been extremely, I think, very exciting work that's happened in the last 20 years is in the area of conflict forecasting. There's been amazing work using statistical models, looking at big data, just amazing work that's being done. But again, in terms of conflict prevention, that plays a very important role, but it's not going to be enough just to stop there. You can't just stop with accurately estimating the probability of a large-scale event that is going to happen. You have to be able to go beyond that in order to actually prevent conflict. There was a very cynical political scientist one time who said, it doesn't take a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. I disagree with this particular political scientist. I feel like sometimes you do need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. However, if you're sitting in Abuja, say you're the conflict advisor to DFID, and someone gives you a report, an accurate, well-researched, methodologically sound report that says, look, there is an 88.6% chance that there's going to be medium to large-scale election violence in February of 2015. It will be useful in terms of mobilizing, resources and things, but it won't necessarily help you know how to solve the problem. In fact, looking at the trends over time, clearly, looking at Nigeria, this shows you several, trend lines using ACLED data. If you're sitting in Abuja, you're aware of the fact that there's elevated risk. You may not be able to quantify it, but you know there's elevated risk. You need more help than just a probabilistic answer in order to help you do your job well. So the red flag is very important, right, for conflict early warning. But we need to go beyond that. We need to be able to take a people-to-people approach as well. Try to figure out how we can get information to people on the ground who are working in the conflict management space to help them do their job better. Going back to that last slide, I won't click back, but, at the Fund for Peace, we've kind of done both. We started off over the last 10 years or so, doing the failed states index, which is now called the fragile states index. Trying to use data and estimate relative pressure from one indicator to the next and one country to the next. But we found that what we want to do now is really figure out how to move from the red flag to the people-to-people approach. Not rejecting the red flag. We continue to do that as well. But I'm more interested in taking this next step. So you could be the conflict advisor to USAID or DFID in Abuja, for example. It's all right. Or you could be the traditional leader of Edo State. Maybe you're the Oba of Benin in Edo State, and you've got very practical things that you have to do in order to mitigate conflict risk. You have to do things that every project has to do. You got to do baseline assessments. You got to make decisions about resource allocation. You have to do monitoring and evaluation of your programs. And typically, what tends to happen, at least historically, is that you do your due diligence as best you can. You do your key informant interviews. You do your desktop assessments and things. But it tends to be somewhat ad hoc. However, now with new technologies that are available, there's some really exciting opportunities for aggregating data across a wide range of sources, and being able to make that data searchable, maybe on a web map, using and then having analytical functions and things. And the rest of this presentation would be sort of highlighting an example of how that has been working. In the case of Nigeria, there's a foundation called the Foundation for Partnership Initiatives in the Niger Delta, and they have a really exciting project called Partners for Peace. And what we've identified in this project is that we really need to have very strong multi-stakeholder collaboration around these issues, both in terms of the data collection and aggregation and analysis, and then also in the conflict mitigation side as well, because these are very complex issues, and you can't just say, the security sector alone is tasked with doing this particular job. The security sector has to be communicating well with civil society, has to be communicating well with private sector, has to be able to communicate with academics, and typically these groups don't communicate very well with one another. It's very difficult, for very good reasons, for these groups to communicate with each other. But what we've been able to do is say, okay, well, let's develop a platform and also the social infrastructure, so both the technology infrastructure and the social infrastructure, so that all of these stakeholders can work together more effectively. On the very sort of basic side, what we've done is, and this isn't unique to this project. I mean, you're all familiar with these technologies, but what we've done is say, well, who's out there that has data? In the case of Nigeria, there's the ACLED data set. There's Nigeria Watch out of the University of Ibadan. There's the Unlock project that I direct in Nigeria, which is a civil society-generated data set. We have workshops all across Nigeria every few months with local stakeholders to sort of assess the conflict landscape. And then there's the P4P network. So there's all these different data sets. There's the excellent Nigeria Securities Tracker that Ambassador Campbell does at the Council on Foreign Relations. So all of these data sets are available. Some focus on different things, but we were able to sort of develop partnerships with all of these institutions and then integrate that data onto a common platform, which allows you to sort of triangulate data and cross-validate sources and also see, which states have the most violence, or which, and then drill down to the LGAs, which LGAs or local government areas have the most violence. So being able to get a very clear picture of the patterns and trends with regards to conflict risk. However, there's another side to the picture that is really critical if this kind of tool, this kind of technology is going to be successful, and that's not only looking at the hot spots and the pressures and the patterns and the trends, but also looking at where are your assets? Where are there folks on the ground, initiatives on the ground, who are self-identified as agents of peace? So, we have a cool little tool where you can do your heat maps and do your trend lines and your bar charts and look at, various levels of granularity. And then you can, layer that over top of, the maps of where there are folks who are working on youth, or folks working on gender, or folks working on economic development, or folks working on, conflict sensitivity. So that really helps folks who are, for example, this conflict advisor in USAID or DFID, to be able to know, okay, so we know where the problems are. Now let's figure out how we can work with the local stakeholders who are self-identified as agents of peace and support them and facilitate better networking among them. So, so it's not only the hot spots, it's also the assets. So, sort of in conclusion, I guess, we found that it's very important to build a social infrastructure as well. So if we talked about technology, technology is absolutely key, but without the social infrastructure, the technology is going to sit on a computer screen, and people in Washington are going to sit, looking at their computers, and it'll be great reports that are written and so on. But in terms of the actual work on the ground that needs to be done in terms of mitigating the conflict risk, it's got to go beyond the technology. It has to move towards building social infrastructure. So, we have, in the case of Nigeria, in Abuja, we developed a working group with the donors and the practitioners at the national level to meet every 2 months. They're having a meeting tomorrow. I wasn't able to be there. But they meet regularly to talk about how they can, after looking at, the situational awareness piece, how can they better collaborate on addressing these issues. Right now everybody's focused on Boko Haram in the north, but if you look at the data, there's micro trends that you can see in the Niger Delta that have to be understood by these folks in order to not be surprised when things do get worse as they are currently in the Niger Delta, for example. But, and this is my last point, it's, what we're really excited about is moving beyond even the Abuja level national sort of working group side, but taking data down to the community level. And that's what we're doing a lot of now too, is this week, in fact, they're having, local level participatory conflict assessments at the local level throughout the Niger Delta, because we recognize that this data alone, this cool map that we have here, and I have cards I can hand out that give you all the information. You can play with it yourself. It's great to have. I mean, this map and data only go so far in terms of telling you the patterns and trends. It doesn't tell you nothing about the causes and nothing about the solutions. So the causes of the conflict and the solutions to the conflict have to be developed through a participatory and qualitative process with local stakeholders on the ground. So that's what we're doing at the local level now, taking this data down to the community level and doing those assessments. And hopefully this whole ecosystem that technology allows us now to develop will be able to help create the dialogue necessary in order to prevent conflict in the future.
So I think this was really great. First, we heard about some of the technology that's being developed. We started talking about forecasting, and also talking about data and data that's being shared. Now we're moving beyond that to what do you do with the forecasts. If you have forecasts of hotspots, you also need to know where your assets are, and then you need to be collaborating with others and bringing the data. Again, I keep hearing this. We need to be making sure that the data is open, it's available to the community, it's available to advocates and the public. So I think that we might be able to get Chris Tuckwood on the line. Is he on there now?
Hi.
Oh, there he is. We can hear you. This is wonderful.
Okay, good. I'm probably going to forego any video, just because bandwidth seems to be an issue here.
That's fine.
Okay, great. Also, I'm getting some pretty rough feedback, so I'm going to mute. If you guys could mute your microphone, perhaps.
Okay, we're working on it.
Okay, well, I can just silence my own speakers for now. And if you have any questions or comments or whatever, just kind of wave at the camera maybe, and I'll start listening in.
You sound great.
Good. So thanks for having me. Unfortunately, with some of the technical difficulties, I haven't really caught everything that was said up to this point, though I have been listening as much as possible. So I hope that I don't repeat anything that somebody has already said or what have you. But that's the situation we have. So bear with me. Like I said, thanks for having me. I'm clearly in pretty good company on the panel, and I'm pretty happy about that. And I just regret that I couldn't be there in person. I just wrapped up at another conference, Build Peace, here at MIT this weekend, and so I'm in Boston at the moment and couldn't make it. By this similar token, I apologize if there's any background noise from where I am. I was actually just clearing out of the hotel I was at for the conference this morning, so I'm currently set up in the business center here before moving to other accommodations for the next few days. So if there is anything in the background, I hope it doesn't interrupt too much. And I do have slides that could go along with what I'm saying, but I've had bad experiences with screen sharing on Hangouts, so I'm just going to go ahead with the blank screen, unfortunately, and my voice. So hopefully that manages to hold the interest well enough. So what I'm going to do is just for the next maybe 10 minutes or so, and then if we're able to, I'll gladly take questions later on. Sort of restrict my comments on Rwanda specifically, although that's obviously the significant sort of event or anniversary that's brought us together, because I don't want to repeat what's already been said, but rather, as others I gather have been doing, look at sort of the state of the world today and going forward what technology means for us in ensuring that sort of thing doesn't happen again, or that if it does, that we react with greater capabilities. So the Sentinel project often looks at technology as being something which presents us with a time of opportunity right now. To give you a bit of background on what we do, our mission is to assist communities at risk of mass atrocities wherever and whenever they happen around the world, of course, with resource constraints in mind as a small NGO. But there are two things that underline or sort of undergird are the foundation of that mission for us. And one is cooperation with threatened communities, and I think the value of that is fairly self-evident both in moral and practical terms. And the other sort of big piece of the foundation is the innovative use of technology. And
so sorry, everybody. Our last speaker is also on the... Yeah. So sorry if you're listening, Chris and Patrick, we're working on it.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so as I stand up in the middle of the room,
Here.
I have to rush out to get this.
Why don't you?
No, it's fine. So the question of knowing what's happening, this technology helps a lot. Forecasting what might happen, this technology all helps a lot. But you know what? In Armenia in 1914, we knew what was happening. There were dispatches, there were telegraphs that came back. Rwanda, we knew what was happening. Bosnia, we knew what was happening. Cambodia, we knew what was happening. But nobody chose to do anything about it. So how do you use this information? How do you use this technology? And I know that some of our other two speakers are probably going to address some of this, but we'll give you a chance to start your theories, preempting them while we get them back online. What good is having more knowledge if still nobody's going to do it?
That's exactly the right question. That's why we take the approach that we do, which is to say, look, let's not focus only on the red flags. Let's not focus only on sort of the knowledge of, the level of risk, for example, in terms of conflict. Let's figure out how we can empower those people who are currently living and working in the conflict management space and give them more information to do what they're already doing, as opposed to trying to motivate people who aren't doing anything in the first place. Let's figure out, let's empower the USAIDs, the DFIDs, and the traditional leader in Edo State, and the CBOs, the community-based organizations, the women's groups, the youth groups. Let's figure out how we can get them engaged in a network, in a multi-stakeholder collaborative network, using technology, but also using real-world, meetings face-to-face on a regular basis to exchange information, to write reports, to send out alerts, as well as to inform their work in very concrete ways. Help them be better in their resource allocation, in their monitoring and evaluation, in their program design. So how we can empower people who are already in the project management space, already wanting to do something, how we can help them do what they do even better.
If I could just add on that too, I think, Nate, you hit on a really, really good point too, which is technology is really only as powerful as the folks that are actually holding it themselves. And so one of the things, in addition to using satellite imagery, for example, to provide irrefutable evidence, you can get an image 2 days after a particular incident occurred, take that to policymakers and say, hey, this is indeed happening, this happened 2 days ago, and here's irrefutable evidence of it happening. So the policy response time, I think, we're seeing the gap narrowing. But I think, too, it's getting the technology into the hands of the people that need it the most. One of the projects that we're working on right now at Amnesty is called Panic Button, and it's an emergency response peer-to-peer mobile application. It's very simple, but it's part of the design process and part of the testing and the provision of this application is to really get folks to start to think about their own security. So who would be their 5 trusted contacts that they put in to the mobile application if an alert indeed needed to be triggered. And so again, it's we can be sitting here in Washington using all of the technologies available to us, but it is really getting the technology into the hands of the folks that need it and working with them in a way that addresses their needs, as opposed to, oh, we have this wonderful idea, at this university, we think it would be fantastic, let's do it, without even consulting the folks that are most at risk or that most need the technology.
Did you want to add anything, Jay?
Just to say that I would endorse all of what both Nate and Katie said already. I also want to encourage people to think of those as separate problems. If we think anticipation is a hard problem, then policy is a much harder one. And I think we need to be careful to avoid burdening every project that does anything in this space with the task of going from soup to nuts, of defining the problem, anticipating the problem, and formulating the appropriate response. What our project is trying to do is work on the narrower and specific job of helping do the anticipation part, right? And part of the goal of that being very explicitly to inform projects like the one Nate's working on, so what are some other countries they might consider working in that they're not working in now, where we aren't already seeing violence but might in the near future. That's the goal of that. As far as what the appropriate policy would be, our models can't tell us that. The statistical models won't answer that question. You can't design social scientific research that will give you solid answers to that. It is an art, not a science, and a much harder one than the forecasting part. So I feel for the people who have to make those decisions and do that job. And we're hoping to help them, again, create more opportunity for them, have more choices about what to do by having more time and a sharper sense of where the risks are. That's really what we see our goal as.
So we're still working on getting this back up. I have a question for you. If we look 5-10 years in the future, what are some of the new exciting technologies and new exciting systems? You described the system that you're building, but beyond that, what are some of the new and exciting things we have to look forward to that we haven't talked about today yet?
One thing, looking at the development of satellites, what we're starting to see, and we're going to see more and more, is real live video feed from satellites. So actually being able to monitor, not just have the high resolution imagery, but we'll actually be able to get video from satellites of particular areas, which is really, really exciting, and I think provides a lot of opportunity. So I think in the next 5 to 10 years, in the next 5 years, we'll see that become pretty mainstream.
Other thoughts?
I'd kind of answer it with a negative, not to be discouraging, but again, as a reminder of we're making tremendous gains in terms of information gathering and again, sort of forecasting things and so on. But also, I think it's important to remember that that's really unevenly distributed, and we heard about that, some of that already. So places like Central African Republic, we're in this age of the smartphone and so on, but this is a place that still most of the country is effectively off the grid. Even, a lot of the population still doesn't have smartphones. In one of the places where, one of the worst episodes of mass killing in recent history is happening right now. And my hunch is that will not be fully resolved in 5 to 10 years either. So, whereas in contexts like Syria, we did see a tremendous amount of information coming out. One of the things now turning to a sort of more positive answer to your question, some of the really interesting stuff going on in contexts like that involves trying to partially automate, probably not fully automate in the next 5 to 10 years, but partially automate the task of sorting out, of verifying the information coming out of contexts like that, which is obviously tremendously important. As soon as you get new information streams, you get misinformation and disinformation streams with them, because this is all politically, legally, and so on, extremely contentious. There's a lot at stake in controlling that information, which means dumping a lot of noise in there as well as actual documentary evidence. So there's some really cool work going on crowdsourcing and using other kinds of technological processes to verify or unverify, whatever the antonym is, information coming out of contexts like that, which will be really important, I think, both for conflict prevention and also for legal and sort of prosecutory efforts. And again, I think that'll, because of the sort of machine learning stuff that's behind that, I suspect that'll get a lot more powerful in the next 5 to 10 years.
And just the validation of the video and the social, like the citizen-submitted content that's coming out of some of these pretty sound technological places such as Syria. I mean, that I mentioned earlier, Syria opened up tons of new questions for us as human rights researchers. All of a sudden, we had tons of videos coming across our desks, tons of information over Twitter, and we were like, how do we go about leveraging this information for human rights protection purposes? How do we verify something that is being used as propaganda or is indeed what it says it is? And you can't say 100% that this is indeed a video of an alleged extrajudicial execution that occurred at this point in time at this location. You can say, with some level of certainty, but there is a whole methodology that's being developed. Our partners at Witness, Storyful, and NIST, we've all been working together to, develop a methodology for the validation of citizen-submitted content. But I think that that's also something we're going to see more and more over the next 5 to 10 years, and perhaps there will be some machine. There will have to be at some point, but there will also have to be kind of the human touch on it as well, because you can't have everything like this run through machines. You'll also see it used more and more as evidence in courts during judicial proceedings.
Right. Okay, let me check into the technology people. How close are we? We're ready for this. Oh, okay. So, what if we tried this? What if we have, I can see if Chris can give me a call and finish his presentation by cell phone. How about that? Speakerphone.
Always the good backup.
Yeah.
In the meantime, does anybody in the audience have any questions or thoughts for our speakers, including our 2 speakers who are coming in the next session, Ignacio and Bukeni? Do either of you have questions or comments? Not right now. Yeah, go ahead. Do you want to come to the mic? You just have to turn it on. You can yell, but they can't hear you on the webcast if you don't go into the mic.
So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the government and government efforts to curb access to social media platforms, such as Turkey's recent
Sure, that's a good question. It's being currently debated right now. I would say, two really quick things. The importance of providing encryption tools for activists around the world. I think that's something that's very key in order for them to be able to securely communicate. Having a government shut down a social media site is in a direct violation of an individual's right to free speech. So not only crackdowns on folks peacefully protesting in the streets, but also those seeking to organize in the digital space. So that is a violation of their human rights. Everything ranging from, as I had mentioned earlier, providing different encryption tools, different secure chat tools for activists to be communicating, so governments can't effectively tap into their communications is really important. And then they can use everything ranging from proxy servers to other different ways of mitigating government crackdown on basic, censorship and surveillance. But there's also a really cool project that's being worked on by the Open Technology Institute. It's called Commemoration. It's a mesh web network, which basically it's internet in a suitcase is the term that they're using to describe it, but basically it's internet that you set up via a mesh network that you can take wherever you want to go. It's being tested out in some very remote locations around the world, but also in areas where the government is known to be actively surveilling communications. So I think that there are a lot of possibilities out there, and it's back again to what folks we keep kind of coming back to. It's getting the right technologies into the folks' hands that need it the most, and learning with them how to best use those technologies for their own needs while not putting themselves at risk.
Okay, I think we have Chris on the line. Let's see if this is going to work. Chris, want to go ahead? Can you?
Hi, so I can go ahead?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So I will pick up where I think I left off. And basically I was just starting to illustrate sort of the contrast between 1994 and 2014 when it comes to information. So, and the technologies that we use to move information around. So, 20 years ago, the most advanced piece of technology that most people in the world had access to would be a landline phone or maybe a fax machine or television, that sort of thing. A lot of tools that facilitated really just one-to-one communication, but with some requirements of resources, or else more like mass media type things. Fast forward to the mobile phones and the internet did exist at that time, but they were still relatively uncommon, especially outside of developed countries, and were pretty expensive even there. So, you fast forward to the year 2014, and we live in a world where there are, I think the most recent number I've seen is 4.5 billion unique mobile phone subscribers worldwide, with the fastest growth rates happening, happening in developing countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. We have 2.7 billion people who are internet users, or at least have the ability to use internet if they so choose, in some capacity, and so on. So this is a very different environment. So, you look 20 years ago, and a lot of governments use the excuse that we didn't know, or we didn't know the extent of what was happening in Rwanda. That's absolutely untrue, especially for the majority of, countries, of governments that could have reacted in some constructive way. And actually, while we were waiting to get back on the line, Patrick and I were just chatting about that. There was no shortage of information when it was coming to decision makers and that sort of thing. It was really a policy failure that prevented any kind of action. But when it comes to members of the public, that excuse, so to speak, does become a little bit more valid, because at that time, like I said, most people, even in developed countries, would rely, especially for information on international events, would rely on television and radio and print media. So they were really at the mercy of what producers and editors chose to show them. Today, that's not the the case because we have such a richer information environment. And so this is valuable not just for people, in Western countries, let's say, to stay informed on what's happening in mass atrocity scenarios or potential situations of mass atrocities, but it's also valuable for people living in those places. And so this is really sort of the approach that the Sentinel Project takes. And we're not in sort of the business of advocacy. We're actually not even, I would say, anymore particularly in the business of forecasting or trying to do forecasting, because there are so many other people doing that I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel, and we can sort of rely on the work that is being done by others in that area. But we're really focused on what can be done, and we're shifting towards the local level. What can be done with technology in order to build communal resilience, try to prevent atrocities from happening, but in the event that they do happen, mitigate them so that the impact is less and that people who are in harm's way have a better chance of coping and surviving. So there are a variety of different tools that we've kind of developed for our own use in this area, in terms of like our situation tracker, ThreatWiki, which our analysts use as a working tool, and our hate-based hate speech monitoring program. And even we're interested in exploring areas like the use of unmanned aerial vehicles and the potential there, because that's a technology that's finding a lot of usage in a variety of humanitarian realms, things like disaster response, making that more effective for doing assessments and building up quick situational awareness on disaster impacts, as well as things like anti-poaching and conservation work. So the thing, kind of the idea there is that, this is technology that if it can be used to protect endangered animals, perhaps it can also be used to provide security for endangered humans. That's just an example of the kind of thing that we're looking at. What I'd like to do is kind of transition then into looking at a particular, our sort of flagship project that we have happening right now, and give you an example of something a little less perhaps glamorous than, unmanned aerial vehicles and that sort of thing, but something really concrete that we're doing on the ground in Kenya. And this is our Una Hakika project. Una Hakika is Swahili for Are You Sure? And I'll explain sort of shortly, once I give a bit of context, why that name is significant and why we chose it. So within Kenya, there are a variety of sort of low-level localized conflicts around the country between different ethnic groups for a variety of different reasons. And one that we've kind of zoomed in on is in the Tana Delta, which is a region in eastern Kenya, sort of southeastern Kenya along the coast, where we have between August 2012 and January 2013, a series of massacres between the two primary ethnic groups in the area, the Makomo, who are predominantly farmers, and the Orma, who are semi-nomadic pastoralists, herders of cattle. And in the course of that 6 months, around 160, some estimates go up to 200 people were killed in what is not just a case of conflict between, two armed groups getting together and sort of fighting, but really an atrocity, a conflict of a sort of an atrocity type nature, where villages were being burned, women and children and unarmed men were being killed. There was a level of sexual violence, an element of mutilation, and so on. So we had, of course, a lot of people killed, a lot more wounded, tens of thousands, I believe 40,000 displaced, which is significant in any event, but especially out of a population of 240,000 people. So we have this sort of microcosm of conflict happening for a variety of reasons. But the one thing that we found when we went a little over a year ago now to do a kind of a brief survey of the area is that misinformation was very significant. So by misinformation, I mean organic, kind of naturally arising rumors, as well as disinformation, which we characterize as being more like deliberately created information by somebody who's intent on achieving an objective. So let's say a politician, which has been often the case, especially around election times, who is spreading rumors or doing incitement or sort of a hybrid of the two in order to gain some kind of political advantage. And so this is something that is really was seemingly significant in the area, so we set up we started to kind of come up with the idea for Una Hakika, and the idea here is to crowdsource essentially rumor reports so that we can monitor and learn about how rumors arise and flow through the area, and then actually develop and test ways of countering those. And just to give you an example of the kind of rumors we're looking at here, the majority are things that seem kind of mundane, perhaps, to our ears. So things like, Orma herders have intentionally grazed their cattle on a Pocomo farm. That is actually quite significant in this context because people are subsistence farmers or their entire livelihood is tied up in their cattle. So when cows eat a Pocomo farmer's crop, he is suddenly destitute. Or when a Pocomo farmer kills or mutilates an Orma cow, that is a significant offense in that respect. So these are the kinds of things that actually are very grievous, and whether they actually happen or not, the rumors can contribute to significant hostility. You get into more extreme things like Pocomo health workers, supposedly one who tried to inject Orma children with poison instead of vaccine. Things like external actors being rumored to give 3,000 AK-47s to the Orma for the purpose of destroying the Pocomo and driving them off the land. Are these things true? In the majority of cases, likely no. But the important thing is that in some cases, enough people believe them, or at least enough people let them pass without questioning them, that hostility does grow between the groups, and at the very least, distrust grows between the groups. And occasionally, when a particularly extreme rumor comes along and perhaps coincides with other conditions, of course, we don't claim that rumors are the only, cause of the violence that has happened and could happen again. But under the right conditions, these can actually contribute to violence. And some of the attacks that have happened in the past have been preemptive in nature, because one group was anticipating, or one village was anticipating an attack by a neighboring village or something like that. So this is the system that we're setting up. And where technology comes into it is in terms of using mobile phones for basically crowdsourcing those rumor reports, and then also communicating back to the community about what is, the truth, essentially, as we've been able to ascertain it behind rumors. And there's a whole complex process to this that I won't walk you guys through, both in the interest of time and in the interest of not confusing anyone, especially without accompanying visuals. But that's kind of where we're starting in terms of countermeasures, is building upon what we've found through both our sort of qualitative assessments and then surveys that we've done, found to be a real shortage of sort of reliable information sources in the area. So providing this neutral, third-party, hopefully accurate, and hopefully in the long term, trusted source of information for the community there. So that when people hear a rumor, they will think to ask Una Hakika, are you sure? Both of themselves or the person they're hearing it from, or from others who may hear it. And then we'll actually have somewhere to turn where they're likely to get an answer on whether it is true or not, and then have actual accurate sources of information on, with which, or accurate information with which to make decisions about how they relate to neighboring communities, for instance. So this is kind of what we're just setting up right now, but mobile phones are significant in it, as may be the internet, because we've found a higher than expected use of internet and social media in the area. That's significant because we have such a relatively little population spread over a relatively large area, and two groups that generally don't communicate with each other, especially in some of the hotspots around the area. So we're intending to use the technology in order to bridge both those physical distances as well as the social distances. monitoring and countering of rumors more effectively. Longer term, I think we're going to learn a lot of lessons from this project and how it's being done about how local level early warning can be done, because this is really an area that interests me, being able to use a variety of tools and techniques to eventually go from state-focused, state-level forecasting, saying, country X is likely to have mass atrocities happen in the next 3 to 5 years, to a much more sort of granular micro-level forecasting where we can say city or neighborhood or village X is at elevated risk of atrocities in the next, month, week, or day perhaps, in this sort of the ideal scenario, and then act accordingly or be able to have communities there act accordingly. That's simple to say, of course. There's a lot of complexities and a lot of challenges and a lot of risks involved in that, but that's kind of where we're going with this in the long term. So the Tana Delta is where we're really starting off kind of testing some of these concepts. Hopefully that's given kind of a good example for you of where we see technology fitting into things and at the moment and where it potentially is going for the future, at least from a Sentinel project perspective. It really is not just, as we see it, it's really not just about using technologies for forecasting. It fits into every part of the process of forecasting, prediction, prevention, mitigation, etc. And as I said earlier, we're not really tied to one particular tool because we like to remain open-minded to whatever works in a given situation. In the case of Luna Hakika and the Tana Delta, mobile phones just are what seem at this point to make the most sense for accomplishing that. So that's kind of where we're at, and I think we're going to hold any questions there may be until the end. I hope I haven't eaten into Patrick's time if he's up next, but I'll conclude my comments with that. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Chris. And I think we can get you on Google Hangout, but I'm going to keep you on the phone just in case for a couple minutes.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry for all of the technical difficulties again. Patrick, are you there? We hear you. We heard you. You were there? He's there? Oh, Patrick, are you there? Can you hear me?
Are you asking Patrick?
Yes, Patrick.
Very good.
Are you there? Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure. Let me introduce you. Patrick Ball is Executive Director at Human Rights Data Analysis Group and has spent more than 20 years conducting qualitative analysis for truth commissions, non-governmental organizations, international criminal tribunals, and United Nations missions. A great deal of this work has been to support truth and reconciliation commissions through database development and data analysis. Most recently, Patrick provided technical advice to this Special Court in Sierra Leone and the International Criminal Court, and in 2013 he provided expert testimony in Guatemala's Supreme Court trial of General Jose Efrain Rios Montt, the de facto president of Guatemala in 1982 and 1983. Patrick, go ahead. Thank you so much for your patience with us and our technical difficulties today.
Okay, thank you. I hope to say some things that are a little bit controversial here. As you mentioned in the intro, I've worked for 9 truth commissions and 3 UN missions, many NGOs, and 5 criminal tribunals. And that work in all of those cases was organizing data in order to make quantitative statistical arguments. We've used machine learning in particular to determine what is missing. I mean, what we're especially concerned about is what we do not observe in these approaches. And our goal in the argument is to assess whether patterns of violence are consistent with arguments advanced by the prosecution. In particular, as you flagged, I presented expert testimony in the trial for genocide and war crimes of General Efrain Rios Montt in 2013. And so I want to pivot on this idea of what it takes to make an argument about genocide as we reflect on the 100 days of genocide against the Tutsis in 1994. Let me flag that in both of the cases, the war crimes cases in which I presented expert testimony, the trials failed, both against Slobodan Milosevic, who died in the closing weeks of the trial, and Rios Montt, whose case was reversed by the Constitutional Court 10 days after his conviction. So, as we struggle for accountability in cases of genocide and war crimes, we don't always win. And I want to flag that in particular in order to foreshadow my concluding point about the importance of getting this argument right. We can't, I mean, the technology's great. I love technology. I use it all the time. But if it produces the wrong answer, it's not helping us. In fact, it's making things worse. But let's turn to Rwanda. And let's think about what it has meant to look back and to have accomplished a great deal. In our group, we believe that the most important way to prevent genocide is to establish accountability for genocides of the past. Accountability means recognizing what happened, validating the suffering of the victims, and breaking through false moral equivalence. That is, well, there's violations on all sides. What we must do is acknowledge all actors' responsibility, but in proportion to what they have done, and with specific detail about what it is precisely they've done. And that helps us as we identify perpetrators, both institutionally, which armed factions committed the violence, as well as the individuals who committed that violence by their name and their rank and their roles. In some cases, accountability means criminal accountability. It means we can prosecute. But in most cases, it means naming people, sometimes excluding them from public office. There's a broad field of transitional justice that has looked back on the violence of the past, and I believe that the consensus in the field is that more reflection lowers the chance of repetition of the violence. We prevent the repetition of violence by remembering the human costs, by validating the victim's suffering, and most importantly, by this process of accountability I've already mentioned. There are many ways to this accountability. Prosecution is one of them. I think it's in many ways our goal. It's the highest level of accountability, but it's rare that political circumstances allow us to reach prosecutions. As we remember today the 100 days of genocide against the Tutsi in 1994, we have a couple of things that come out of that as these lessons that we can look back on. And one is certainly accountability. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda has done a really pretty good job, in my opinion, of establishing individual accountability for many of the key perpetrators. They've named them, they've convicted many of them, and we have a lot of information about the roles of these specific people. It's not as clear to me that we've done as good a job in Rwanda as we'd like about understanding the context, the roots, the antecedents of violence. I think truth commissions in other places have done a better job at that kind of articulation. And I think there are interesting and challenging questions about whether the tribunal has sustained a high quality of due process, guaranteeing the rights not only of the victims but of the accused. It's not clear to me that that has been as well respected. One of the most dangerous aspects of having criminal accountability without historical memory is that we lose context. We lose the sense that the 100 days were situated both in the antecedents that came before and what I want to talk about next, what has come after the violence in Rwanda in 1994. Since the violence in Rwanda, Central Africa has been racked by successive waves of violence. I would say that violence has been endemic, particularly in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And the violence in Congo started in large part as a result of the genocide in 1994. In the immediate aftermath of the genocide, hundreds of thousands of Rwandans, primarily ethnic Hutus, fled to what was then called Zaire. They settled in massive refugee camps along Zaire's eastern border, creating both humanitarian catastrophe in public health, in nutrition, as well as a political catastrophe, since armed groups closely linked with the perpetrators of the 1994 genocide ran raids into Rwanda and then came back and sheltered among the refugees. Tiring of those raids, the Rwandan authorities struck, first in cross-border raids and then in a full-scale invasion in 1996. During that invasion, tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people were killed by Rwandan forces. By Rwandan forces, and this is the critical point here, by the very military structures that ended the genocide in 94, committed what the UN later called potentially acts of genocide in Congo. Now, let's think about that for a minute. The army of the victims from 1994 committed acts of violence so massive that several UN commissions found that there were indicia, that is, starting points for investigations, potentially indictments if there were a competent tribunal, which there isn't, that acts of genocide were committed against the Hutu population. UN investigations in 1997, a commission in 98, and then a comprehensive review in the mapping project of 2010 raised all of these concerns with the detail required to substantiate those claims. They did not conclude that the Rwandan forces committed genocide. Instead, in particular, they questioned whether the intent was to eliminate in whole or in part the Hutu population. But nonetheless, the violence was so extreme, thousands, tens of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of people died, either directly by killing or as a result of excess mortality caused by the interventions. So today, at the 20th anniversary, we'll hear many well-founded critiques of UN peacekeepers' failure to intervene in 1994. But the investigations and reports that the UN wrote about the violence in the 1990s in Congo have been excellent. And all this said, the world community has failed to prevent the continuous repetition of violence in Congo since that time, even until the present day. This is not a question of moral equivalence. I am not suggesting that what the Rwandan forces have done in Congo is the same as what the Interahamwe did during the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. That's lazy thinking. Our job is to understand the past, which means thinking about each event with its details, its particularities, and the structure of accountability. Historical memory is our method for preventing future violence. Now, I'm a statistician. This is a very different kind of talk than I normally give. I normally worry about quantitative facts. I present estimates. I talk about confidence and credible intervals. I worry about getting the story right, including what we've missed. From the pieces I've been able to hear through the technical issues, I do not share the optimism of my co-panelists about the use of technology in the prevention of genocide. I spend most of my time worrying about the foundations of statistical knowledge, about what's missing, about sampling problems, and consequently, I am deeply skeptical that in particular crisis mapping and crowdsourcing provide a foundation for quantitative analysis. I would urge us all to remember that every map, every infographic, every forecast is a form of statistical reasoning which requires for its validity a sound sampling foundation. And if we cannot mathematically establish that sampling foundation, we must be deeply skeptical of conclusions. Further, I would urge us not to overstate the importance of information. In the case of the 100 days in Rwanda, there was extensive real-time information. I was living in Addis Ababa working for the War Crimes Tribunal, the National War Crimes Tribunal there, during the 100 days in Rwanda. And from Addis, I got excellent real-time coverage. We had reports that started before the 7 April beginning of that we've now declared as the official beginning of the genocide. We were clear, we were on high alert at the time. We knew it was coming in Addis. And I assure you that if we knew in Addis, they knew in New York, they knew in Geneva, they knew in London. There were New York Times op-eds that occurred in the immediate days at the very beginning of the conflict. The world was well aware of this. We had photographs, we had phone calls coming out of Rwanda, we had all kinds of information. The failure of policy was not a failure of information. And consequently, as we think about new ways to build prevention mechanisms, we should not premise our assumption, or we should not premise our construction of these tools on the notion that if we had only had better information for Rwanda, the world would have acted differently. I don't think that's true. As someone who uses machine learning to build statistical models, that's what I do all day long, that's my job. I'm very skeptical that models about conflict, about highly rare events that have very complicated and situation-unique antecedents are forecastable. I worry about early warning because when we build models, we listen to people less. I know that from my work in the UN, when we have a room full of people who know an awful lot about what's going on the ground, a graph, when someone puts a graph on the table, everybody stops thinking. They just look at the graph. and that worries me a lot. In 1994, human rights experts warned the world about what was happening. No one listened. So as we, as technologists and people who like technology, when we ask questions of data, we have to make sure that if anybody's going to listen to us, we better be giving them the right answers. Now, I want to just change directions entirely and say that any technology that facilitates communication seems to me to be useful. But that said, let's hope that all of that technology helps us to avoid the trap of breaking history into moments or cases or specific events. This is not how history works. History flows from one thing to another. One damn thing after another is in fact a cliche and not how history works. And so we have to see antecedents, events, and consequences as fundamentally linked, both in a technical sense as well as in a qualitative and analytic sense. We need to keep in mind that genocide breaks in a moment populations into victims and perpetrators, but those categories are highly fluid. And in the immediate antecedents or in the immediate consequences, those categories may flip back and forth many times, not just once or twice. Forgetting about violence, forgetting about responsibility and accountability, allowing perpetrators to gain international stature may enable the next rounds of violence. And so I want to close by asking that the best way to honor the memories of the victims of the 1994 genocide of the 100 Days against the Tutsis will be to call for memory and accountability for the violence that followed in Congo. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Patrick. So we're running a little bit over time, but I want to allow us to have at least about 10 minutes for discussion, maybe a little bit longer. So I'd love to hear for those of you panelists here in the room, and also Christopher can join in online. First, reactions and thoughts regarding Patrick's presentation. I'm sure you have some reactions. And then also, since we are sitting here in the law school with future lawyers, policymakers, and judges in our audience, what is your advice to these folks in terms of how to use the data that you've been gathering, the local networks, the systems that you've talked about? What is your advice to them? So go ahead, anybody, reactions and advice.
Sure. Just reacting to Patrick first. I'm not sure where he heard the three of us being extremely optimistic about the power of information to stop or prevent genocide. I think all of us were attempting to be realistic about the limitations of that. That said, on the issue of how forecastable are things, I mean, that's partly an empirical question that we try to answer in the development of the models we're working with. And I think there's what's important is to be realistic about, as Patrick rightly points out, that these are hard events to anticipate and we can't be precisely accurate. And to recognize the uncertainty around any forecast we offer, being realistic about that's critical. At the same time, we know that people are making decisions about planning and prevention and that kind of thing. They are going to engage in those planning actions, and they are going to use some kind of information in doing that. If it's in the absence of anything else, they're going to use their own intuition. So whatever we can do to give them marginally better information, not perfect information, which we know we can't get, but marginally better information than their intuition. And there I'm confident we can do that, even with statistical models that are imperfect, of rare events that are hard to forecast, or with the kind of expert crowdsourced forecasting that I was talking about as the other component of what we're doing. Again, we know the forecasts that come out of that process aren't perfect, but we also have strong evidence that they're better than what an individual sitting around would say, and they're certainly better than the sort of, gut reaction. So given that kind of planning and foresight activity is going to take place, doing what we can to marginally improve that information can have some value. Asserting that is not the same thing as saying it will stop genocide or, some sort of Pollyannish notion that, that is the sum total of the problem. And I think none of us asserted that.
Other reactions or advice to law students? I think we can, is Chris online too? So Christopher, if you also have any thoughts or any reaction that you wanted to add?
Sorry, if that was directed at me, I am here on the Hangout, not on the phone anymore. I didn't totally hear what the question or comment may have been.
Yes, sure. So I was saying I wanted to give you an opportunity to provide any reaction to Patrick's presentation, and also any advice to future lawyers, policymakers, judges who are here in the room with us at the law school today regarding the systems, the data, the networks that you guys have been talking about today.
Sure. So regarding Patrick's presentation, I agree with pretty much every point that he brought up, I have to say. And on the second sort of point that you had regarding what could I say to, your future lawyers and judges and policymakers and so on, that not being a realm that I'm particularly knowledgeable on myself, I can say that these are relevant topics to stay engaged on, because new tools, particularly my understanding is from people I've talked to, introduce new sort of questions and new sort of risks into legal processes. So for instance, if we're talking about human rights documentation, if you're using new technologies like satellite imagery, let's say, in order to document atrocities and other human rights abuses, that imagery, if it's to become, let's say, admissible evidence in a prosecution after the fact, needs to be handled in a certain way. It needs to be gathered and handled and transmitted and archived in a certain way. And this is a recurring theme that I've heard coming up. So that's just one sort of anecdotal example, but I would say that with new tools like this and with the social sort of impacts that they often have, there are a lot of unforeseen complications that come along. And so staying abreast of those really would, I can imagine, only stand you in good stead in your future careers, especially if you continue focusing on these types of issues.
Great, thanks, Chris. If anyone in the audience has a question, why don't you come up to the microphone? But I wanted to see if Nate or Katie, if you have any things you want to add.
Just to, I guess, respond to Patrick's point, I think he made some excellent points. And as regards what technology can realistically do, the question is, what are you asking the technology to do? Mm-hmm. Are you asking the technology to prevent genocide? Probably that would be a few bridges too far. But if you're asking the technology to facilitate better information exchange among those who are in the conflict management space, to be marginally more effective in specific tasks that they are asked to carry out in the course of their work, then I say it's a great thing, and we should encourage the use of such technologies in order to help folks make good decisions about resource allocation and site selection and monitoring and evaluation and things like that. So from my mind, that's what we should be asking technology to do, and forecasting as was mentioned earlier, can be very, very helpful, particularly at very high levels, as people are making decisions about, where to look, a sort of a triage kind of thing. It can be very useful. But yes, technology is never going to be the answer to preventing genocide. And as regards the last question of how to how those in the legal profession, what they might take away from this. The thing that just occurred to me was that in workshops that I've had in different countries, when you bring sort of the human rights lawyers together with the interfaith the interfaith peace building actors together, it's clear that the groups look at things very differently from one another. That, I think, was sort of it's a recurrent thing that I see in Uganda. You know, the lawyers were meeting with civil society, and just the communication between the two groups is sometimes fraught with misunderstanding. So I think that hopefully, as we build these platforms for multi-stakeholder collaboration, these kinds of miscommunications might be able to be ironed out over time.
Yeah, I'll just add really quickly too. I mean, I think as a human rights practitioner, particularly focusing on documentation efforts, these new tools provide us. These new technological tools are new tools in our kind of traditional human rights toolkit when it comes to documenting abuses. So, we're not going to be able to show everything using satellite imagery. Mass graves, for example, are oftentimes very difficult to show. Anything in the DRC, it's under 90% cloud cover all of the time, so you're not going to be able to use satellite imagery to document particular crimes. So, technological tools are they're not the solution to everything, but they are supplementing our ability to do our job as human rights researchers every single day. And then back to future lawyers, one of the kind of main themes that our team has been looking into, and so many other colleagues in this field, how can we really be equipping courts with the ability, with the knowledge and the ability to be using this type of data as evidence during judicial proceedings? Courts are pretty far behind, especially international and regional judicial mechanisms. And so how can we all be better working with lawyers, with prosecutors, with judges, to teach them about the use of this type of data that's been derived using GIS, citizen-submitted data to supplement a particular court case. So I think that's kind of a challenge that I would throw out to all of you guys as you're, studying law and interacting more, with various courts. We've got to catch the courts up. The human rights community is catching up. Others are catching up. But in order for us to effectively hold those perpetrators accountable for their actions, we have to have effective judicial mechanisms that are able to handle this type of information. So that's kind of a challenge for everyone at this point.
Leslie, can I add it?
Yes, go ahead.
When we build technology for human rights, I think we need to be somewhat thoughtful about how our less technical colleagues are going to hear the things that we say. In a lot of meetings over a lot of years, I've listened to very sophisticated, thoughtful, legal, qualitative, ethnographic arguments about very specific events occurring on the ground. But almost inevitably, when someone proposes some kind of quantitative analysis, all that thoughtful reasoning escapes the room. It's good to say, and in fact something that I've taken great pleasure in over the years is that we're going to integrate our quantitative analyses into broader arguments that include reasoning from other disciplines, legal disciplines, social science disciplines, and so forth. But the practical effect of introducing any kind of quantitative argument is that it displaces the other arguments that are on the table. And we are naive to think otherwise. What that means is that the stakes for getting these kinds of claims right are very high. If we make quantitative claims and we're wrong because our sampling foundations are weak, because our model is inappropriate, because we've misinterpreted the error around our claim, or for any other reason, we can do a lot of harm. And so I would propose that one of the foundations of any kind of quantitative claims making is that we need to have very strict validation before we propose a conclusion to be used by our broader community. There are all kinds of rules about validation in model building. We know a lot about it. We have a lot of contexts in which we have ground truth. We have a lot of historical detail. Some of that historical detail is itself beset by these sampling problems, but we have opportunities to do validation. And I think that any argument, any claim that we make, especially to non-technical audiences, should lead with that validation rather than leaving it to the technical detail. By avoiding discussing the technical problems in front of non-technical audiences, we're hiding stuff that might not be working. So I warn us all to be much stricter. And I assure you that my colleagues and I spend a lot of time putting validation arguments, particularly from Kosovo and Timor-Leste, where we have fairly detailed reflections now. We put those arguments up front whenever we try to explain this stuff.
Wonderful. Thanks, Patrick. Well, we've gone way over time, and I hate, and mostly this is due to our technological difficulties, and I hate to keep you guys here. We've already kept you almost a half an hour longer than you were supposed to be. If there are no other questions, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. I think this was a great beginning to what could be a much longer discussion, and I really appreciate all of you taking time out of your busy schedules and having patience with our terrible technology, which is ironic given we were talking about the use of technology today. So thank you so much to all of you. Thank you, Patrick and Chris on the phone as well for your patience with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No worries at all.
And just to let you all know what's going to happen, we're going to go right into Ignacio's presentation in just 2 minutes. So Ignacio, if you want to come up and get ready, we'll go ahead and get started.
No problem.
It's okay.
So thanks for your patience, Ignacio. There are going to be students coming and going. This class time is a little off of our schedule today. But we also know that there are people working on our webcast, which is apparently working. So we're just going to go ahead and move right into the next session. We're calling these active sessions, and we hope that folks who are here will participate and ask questions. I'm really pleased to have with us Ignacio Mojica. He is with Human Rights First, and he is a legal researcher on the Enablers of Mass Atrocities Project. He conducts legal research on issues related to enablers of mass atrocities. In 2013, he obtained his LLM degree at Yale University, and he previously studied law at the University of Chile. His full bio is available on the bios, but we're very happy to have him here to discuss Human Rights First innovative strategy to focus on enablers, the countries, companies, individuals that provide the means that make mass atrocities possible and disrupting the supply chain for slaughter. So Mr. Mojica is going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to go into a brief question and answer period. And thanks again for your patience with us today.
Thank you, Lauren. I want to thank you first, the American University, the Washington College of Law, for organizing this great event. We at Human Rights First are very honored to be a part of this event. So my presentation today is a very brief presentation. I wish to give you a general view of what our Enablers project is. I'm going to speak briefly about 2 case studies, and hopefully we can have a brief Q&A afterwards. The objective of the Enablers project is to identify networks of individuals, corporations, and states who provide material support for entities and groups that in turn commit mass atrocities. For mass atrocities, we understand basically grave violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, such as war crimes, crimes against humanity, and obviously genocide. At Human Rights First, when we crafted this project, we did it with a basic assumption. And that assumption is that committing international crimes requires extensive resources. A group that intends to launch a systematic attack against the civilian population requires weapons, requires ammunition, fuel for its vehicles, and cash money for paying salaries to its soldiers. If we cut the supply chain of those commodities, we can expect then to be able to prevent the escalation or diffuse ongoing situations, thus preventing or reducing the incidence of atrocities. Human Rights First aims then to identify choke points in the supply chains of those enablers, of those enabling groups. Those choke points are where we hope that the legal system can have an effect at disabling those networks of enablers. In other words, what we seek to do is determine how we can use financial sanctions, embargoes, criminal prosecution, both domestic and international, to disable the supply chains of corporations, entities, and persons providing material support for atrocities. So a first question that could arise in relation to this approach is, why are we interested in these choke points in the supply chain? If we know that what you need ultimately to commit atrocities are weapons, why not simply focus on weapons and their transport, their sales, and their final destination? That is, I think, a fair question. I would answer that question saying that that approach is insufficient. First of all, weapons are not the only destabilizing commodity. Many other commodities act in a similar way. Natural resources are very relevant for funding groups that commit mass atrocities. We need, therefore, a broader approach. At the same time, focusing only on the regulation of weapons and ammunition and their sale and transport seems an insufficient approach, because the regulation at the international level of those commodities is not necessarily complete and coherent. I would suggest that the regulation of weapons and ammunition is, at the international level, really made of a pocket of regulations, several pockets of regulations that only cover specific situations, but do not necessarily provide a broad and comprehensive approach. We can look at some examples of this. If the Firearms Protocol, for instance, requires states to establish and maintain effective measures for the transfer of firearms, components, and ammunition. That seems to be a very potentially effective weapon for disabling the transfer of weapons. However, the Firearms Protocol does only apply to non-state transfers. So state-to-state transfers or transactions of weapons are not covered. Other transactions where the interest of national security is involved are also not covered by the Firearms Protocol. Other international conventions that also contain regulations concerning the transfer of weapons are also only of limited help. So, for instance, the Chicago Convention of Civil Aviation contains certain articles that allow states to prevent the use of their airspace for the transportation of weapons. However, that convention only applies, obviously, to civil aviation, leaving out a big part of how weapons are transported across the globe, which is through the use of sea shipments. Accordingly, we consider that we need a broader approach, one that will not only consider the enablers themselves or the commodities that are reaching the conflict zones, but the whole line of supply. So what I do in the remaining time is to examine two particular case studies, if you want, where I consider that the actions of enablers have been fairly well documented. And these are the conflicts in Syria and the conflict in Somalia. These two case studies are interesting because they show how enabling behavior can be very different. We will see that there are very different commodities, destabilizing commodities, being traded in these conflicts. The enablers themselves are very different. We will find state actors and non-state actors, funding state actors and non-state actors. And the legal framework, finally, is also very different. Still, these two cases, I hope, will show that there is still certain aspects that are common to both situations and that highlight a particularly good possibility for finding a choke point in the supply lines of these enablers. A choke point that we believe at Human Rights First can be used to actually disable this conflict's potential. So let's take a look very quickly at the situation in Somalia. What is the destabilizing commodity that is enabling atrocities in this context? And believe it or not, it's actually the sale of charcoal. Charcoal that is produced in Somalia and then is exported into the United Arab Emirates, and its revenues are heavily taxed by Al-Shabaab, who in turn use this money to fund their illicit activities and carry out attacks on the civilian population. So who is buying this charcoal? Who is providing the ultimately the resources that are reaching the group that commits the atrocities? And according to the United Nations Security Council Oversight Committee on Sanctions, there is a fairly established network of merchants operating in the United Arab Emirates who are regularly buying and importing this charcoal from Somalia. Now the question is this trade legal? And the answer in this case is fairly simple. The United Nations Security Council adopted a resolution in 2012 establishing an embargo on charcoal of Somali origin. That means that ultimately any sale, export or import of Somali charcoal is ultimately illegal. And now the final question is, the question that usually strikes law students and some lawyers. If it's illegal, why is it still happening? The answer is that despite all the efforts by the international community, tracking down and disabling these sales of charcoal is extremely hard. These ships often sail undetected and without the cooperation of the neighboring states, which is not as high as we would hope. It is extremely hard to tackle down this network. So in sum, in this situation, we have a group of non-state actors, these merchants, who are providing funds to another non-state actor through the sale of a sanctioned commodity, the illicit sale of a sanctioned commodity. So now let's move on to another situation, the situation in Syria. In Syria, we could say that the major destabilizing commodity at this point is the sale and transfer directly of weapons that are then used by the Syrian regime to conduct systematic attacks on the civilian population. So the question is then, who is enabling this conflict? Who is providing these weapons? According to the State Department, in their recent hearing on Syria before the Foreign Relations Committee, the Senate's Foreign Relations Committee, the main enabler of this conflict at this point is Russia. According to the State Department, Russia has played and continues to play a major role in providing a sustained amount of weapons for the Assad regime. Now, the key question in this context is whether these actions are legal or not. And this is a very delicate question. But I believe that, and this gets us back to the idea of pockets of regulation. In the current legal regime, and in the absence of a United Nations Security Council resolution imposing an embargo on Syria or on the Syrian regime, these sales and transfers are ultimately legal. Accordingly, can someone act against a shipment of weapons coming from Russia to Syria? The answer, I believe, is that it is very hard. And the sad truth, I think, is that the international legal framework provides states with much better tools or a much stronger legal regime to act against perhaps a very small concealed amount of drugs being carried in a ship than an openly carried cargament of AK-47s that we know are going to be used to launch an attack against the civilian population. In sum, in the context of the Syria situation, what we see is a state actor enabling another state actor through the sale or trade of a commodity that is ultimately legal in absence of any resolution by the United Nations Security Council, which is highly unlikely to happen since one of the main actors wields veto power. So what these two case studies show, I believe, is that enabling behavior can be very, very different. We have very different commodities. Charcoal on one extreme, something that would not appear to be a destabilizing commodity by itself, and then weapons on the other. Both legal regimes tend to be very different. One is clearly illegal under the Security Council resolution of 2012, while the other one is not necessarily so. Now, both enablers are also radically different, and both of them are are very different to tackle. One, because it's too big an enabler. So Russia, with its veto power in the United Security Council, can basically control the only way of establishing that this trade is illegal. The other one is perhaps too small an enabler to be detected and effectively disabled. So the question remains then, what can we do about these situations? Or what is common to these situations, and where can we find a potential choke point? We believe that this situation have at least one aspect in common, and that is that both of them are using the sea shipping industry to transport commodities. So weapons are mainly being transported in Syria through ships and sea ships, and also the trade of charcoal into the United Arab Emirates is also being conducted through ships. But why is it relevant? Why is it relevant that sea ships are being used? And the answer is that the shipping industry is it's a globalized industry. Ships are generally owned or operated by international corporations, which might have presence in the United States or in the European Union. Ships also generally need insurance, which is provided by a relatively small market of big companies who generally have presence in the US and the European Union as well. Additionally, these corporations have a particular interest in remaining attached to the financial services of the US or the European Union. That means that this network of companies who are in between and operating this trade of commodities are particularly sensitive to financial sanctions. Accordingly, our position is that a potential choke point for these situations is actually not necessarily addressing sanctions to the enablers themselves or looking for solutions related to the type of commodities that are being traded, but using smart sanctions against the intermediaries of this trade, basically the shipping industry and the insurance companies that provide insurance for the shipping industry. The advantage that we see in this approach is that applying smart sanctions on these actors would allow us to overcome the shortcomings of the legal system in areas such as the regulation of arms sales, which I already said is sparse, and also avoid the problem of targeting the enablers themselves. If this network of small merchants in the United Arab Emirates dealing in Somali charcoal are too small to be targeted by sanctions, perhaps we can forget about that, but focus on the companies that own or have interest in the ships that are being used to transport that charcoal. Similarly, if Russia is outside of the possibilities of applying sanctions for collaborating with the Assad regime in participating in carrying out mass atrocities, perhaps we can target the companies that are being used or that own the ships that are being used to transport weapons into this situation. Now, the final question is, do we have any precedent that confirms that this approach can be used? And the answer is yes. We have a fairly recent example, which is the MV Alayed, a ship that was carrying Russian-made weapons to Syria, which was stopped outside of the shores of Scotland, right after the British company providing insurance for its cargo withdrew the insurance. Once the ship withdrew its insurance, the company withdrew its insurance, the ship had to sail back. This is a good example of how applying sanctions and pushing the intermediaries can actually have a positive effect. Now, the word of caution, and with this I would like to finish, is that this mechanism is one piece in a larger puzzle. Financial sanctions are useful, but only to some extent. And the example of the MV Alayed is sadly also an example of the limited effect that this policy can have. Weeks after the MV Alayed sailed back to Russia, it was reflagged as a Russian ship and it obtained insurance of a Russian company. That meant that a couple of weeks after it had sailed back, it was able to sail unstopped and reach Syria. This means that this approach is potentially useful, but it has to be used with more tools and in a context of a comprehensive approach towards tackling enablers of atrocity. That being said, I think we could perhaps open it up for...
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Ignacio. And thank you for coming all the way down to D.C. I didn't mention earlier that you came all the way this morning. So
my pleasure.
Thank you for being here today. So I think that your examples were fascinating, and the differences between... I'm wondering how you go about tracking to the charcoal sales in Somalia, and how do you apply that in a new context? I mean, this goes back to the use of technology panel that we just had, I'm sure. But if you have a new situation, how do you go about tracking down to the charcoal sales?
Right. That is actually a great question, and I think it's a great way of connecting it with the previous panel. And the answer is that we're not an organization that tracks necessarily this atrocity context. And the examples that I've used are precisely the examples that are well documented on open sources and reliable open sources. In the case of the Somali situation, it's the United Nations Security Council Oversight Committee for Sanctions, pursuant to Resolution 751, if I recall correctly. So there are published studies that are reliable and that have information about who is acting in this context. Also, there's another organization, C4ADS, who has a very interesting work on the Somali situation as well. But it's true. The main problem, I would say, is actually obtaining reliable information, and that that is an area where I think the previous panel, the people in the previous panel are the ones to whom we are looking forward to interact with to obtain reliable information. This is particularly true for the approach that involves applying sanctions. The Office of Foreign Assets Control, who handles the application of sanctions regimes in the U.S., has explicitly said, the representatives have said openly, sanctions require reliable intelligence, which is reasonable, and it must be so. So the biggest challenge I would say is actually obtaining reliable information in time before atrocities are being committed to be able to effectively disable them.
Yeah. Okay, well, I just want to start with that question. That was mine. But I know there's questions from the audience. Please, if you have a question, come to the microphone if you'd like to speak about the web. Yes, Caitlin. You just have to turn the microphone on, but then those who are watching by webcast and the recording will have your voice recorded.
Can you use this word?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Caitlin. I'm a Dean's Fellow at the Center for Human Rights. You mentioned Russia's involvement with Syria and how sanctions are not always effective on Russia, especially in light of recent events. They clearly have a disregard to an extent for any acts of the UN. I was just curious about any collaboration beyond political sanctions and any collaboration for efforts within the private international business community, as far as the shipping industry in particular, efforts to bring them into making sure that these enablers, and you mentioned non-state actors, that they were included as non-state actors, but if you could kind of just describe any collaboration with the private international business.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I think the case of the MV Allied, the ship I'd mentioned, it's a good example precisely of that. I think for instance, the insurance corporations, actors of the insurance industry, are very concerned about the possibility of being sanctioned. I'm sure for strategical reasons. However, in the case of the MV Allied, once the company was notified that it was potentially incurring in sanctions, they withdrew the cover. It wasn't the British government that carried out an official designation of that company and sanctioned it under the EU sanctions regime. They went on and withdrew cover of the insurance, and that was ultimately what stopped the ship. I think that is a good example of how the system should be operating, which is basically with close collaboration with the industry that is involved. I think corporate actors have a big and reasonable interest in not being labeled as enablers of mass atrocities. I don't think anyone running a business would reasonably want to be labeled as someone who is enabling systematic attacks of civilian population. I think that can be used, and companies should use their due diligence in identifying where they might be allowing for this sort of behavior to go on. Otherwise, what we would expect is civil societies, NGOs, and government cooperating directly with companies, feeding them with information so that they can apply the respective measures, such as withdrawing insurance. In particular, the insurance companies nowadays, when it comes to P&I insurance, for instance, protection and indemnity insurance, have adopted general clauses into their contracts that say if you insured incur in sanctionable behavior or risk the company into entering into sanctionable behavior, we can withdraw cover. And that is I think, a major positive development for this approach. I think we absolutely need the cooperation of corporate actors in this matter.
Do you have other questions for Ignacio? Yeah.
So I come back to my favorite topic of political will, right? Sanctions are an intrinsically political solution. You have to have states agree on a sanctions regime. You can make it broad, you can make it targeted. It works sometimes, it doesn't work sometimes. You go and reflag the ship, you get around it, right? We see an interesting phenomenon, especially in the United States, with pharmaceutical companies who are being bashed about their supply of lethal drugs for the death penalty, right? It's a really interesting example of self-regulation in some ways. They don't want to be tarred with the brush, particularly European pharmaceutical companies that live in a context that doesn't believe in the death penalty, to have their drugs used in Alabama or in Texas or Mississippi or wherever, and to kind of implicitly participate. So I think about that, and I think about how far back we can kind of move how we define an enabler, and how do we create consciousness, number one, and then political will from the point of view of the corporation to cease and desist from their participation in enabling bad behaviors by non-state parties or non-state actors or by governments themselves. And your program is one of the unique ones that is actually tracking corporate enablers and defining them that way and trying to raise consciousness about it. But when we're looking at a broader context where, we just heard a whole panel about, well, statistics are really good, but, and technology is great, but, it's not the end-all be-all, and still people have to stop genocide. People have to stop mass atrocity. Politicians have to decide to do it. Where does this fit in? Because I do believe strongly that there is a role for, as our Supreme Court more and more decides, that there are roles for corporate entities as people to stop things or to move things forward. How do we create conditions beyond sanctions regimes to have industries self-regulate in some way?
Right. That's a great question to which I don't think I have a satisfactory answer.
You get ready, because I'm going to ask you that question too.
It's a wonderful question, and yes. So sanctions regimes are usually politically motivated. I wouldn't expect otherwise. I think that is a big part of the issue. We see it with the situation of Russia. It's been documented that Russia has been operating in Syria for a long time. However, no designations have been made under the pre-existing sanctions regime that already targets Syria and enablers in Syria. That is a political question. I think the challenge for our organizations and organizations who do similar work is mustering support among allies here in the U.S., in U.S. Congress, in the U.S. government to channel political will towards making those designations. Now, on the corporate side, corporations, yes, there is a big space for corporations. However, corporations do not act, I believe, as people in a moral sense. However, there is one aspect that is an advantage and can be exploited, which is that basically corporations operate basically on a cost-benefit analysis, and I think the only way to move forward is to tap on those incentives. Corporations might see it as good not to be labeled or associated with enablers of mass atrocities. I think we have to exploit that as a cost, and for corporations, make it evident for them, make it costlier for them to be a part of these networks. Make it evident that the public is aware that transporting weapons is basically equally horrible as selling those weapons themselves and making a profit out of them, and that we will be willing to adopt either sanctions or perhaps criminal prosecution. That is something that depends on each jurisdiction. There are very different approaches to that issue, but it's something that perhaps could also be used. In some, I think my response would be we need to tap on the incentives for corporations to act accordingly to what we consider is in accordance to international law.
Wonderful answer. Are there other questions? That we're getting towards 3:30, and I want to make sure that we have time for Bukini Waruzi's presentation before he also has to get back on the train. Is there one more question? Anybody? No? Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this event.
Thank you very much.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, if you're ready. So you want to sit here or you stand? Okay, well this.
Okay.
You're just going to-
Are you playing video?
Yeah, I'm going to speak a little bit and then the video and then PowerPoint.
Great. Okay. Great. So our last session for today is about citizen action to prevent genocide. And we are pleased to welcome Bukeni Waruzi, who is the Witness Senior Program Manager for Africa and the Middle East. His work focuses on supporting women's rights activists to fight for gender justice and to prevent mass atrocities. He has also worked extensively on the issue of child soldiers, and he was instrumental in the ICC's first trial on this issue. So welcome, Bukeni. Thank you.
So much.
So thank you so very much. I'm so grateful when I received the invitation through Sam Gregory, my colleague, who was in contact with Lauren. And I'm so grateful to be part of this event, especially an event that the whole world is commemorating. And as someone from the region, originally from the region of the Great Lakes region of Africa, it reminds me days back when, the genocide occurred in Rwanda. As someone who is originally from Eastern DRC, I remember very well how we were seeing refugees coming from Rwanda to the Congo. And this wasn't the first time, but back 1 year earlier, in 1993, in Burundi, we saw massive wave of refugees who were coming from Burundi as the first elected president, Melchior Ndadaye, was assassinated, and that triggered the mass atrocities in Burundi at that time in 1993. A year later, we saw what happened in Rwanda, where millions, or the whole country, was dispersed in the Congo. At the time was called Zaire. Of course, these were new events for us, especially our generation, that we didn't see really these kind of a war and killings occurring in a very wide scale and in Burundi and Rwanda. Of course, the Congo has its own history back into colonialism and some of the wars that followed, but our generation at the time had never experienced that before. So this reminds me where the state of mind was, and when I was told to come and speak about this, I was like, oh my gosh, where are we going to start? This is kind of some of those situations where you saw what happened, but not really inside Rwanda, but from the other side of the border, the Zaire, where we had friends who were fleeing with their families just because there was mass killings that were happening in Rwanda. And at that time, were children and women in big numbers. These were the majority of people who were affected, or I mean, who were actually fleeing. There were cars, there were even soldiers, etc. There were, you know, the UN cars were actually crossing the border very often, and we couldn't count the number. We had refugees who were sleeping on the streets. We had everybody, you know, all the parks in the DRC were massively destroyed, and that was normal because these people did not have place to sleep, did not have food, did not have adequate, you know, equipment, and that was the problem. But the question now is, I saw what happened, but what about other people who may not have seen or get a chance to be at the border or being in Zaire, who could even witness that? And that's the central question that I'll try to kind of to debate today. But also, if I were someone who's there, saw and did something to really, you know, record what happened, and then what could I have done, I mean, to prevent, if I were able to do so? Of course, I learned, you know, through these previous panels that the decision makers are the one that can, you know, stop genocide from happening. Yes, but me as a citizen, as a simple individual, what can I do as well to contribute? And, you know, our second speaker today was actually calling us as individuals to do something, to take action, because I believe, and I'm sure you believe, in the first, you know, and the second speaker, and all the speakers actually believe that we can take an action that can prevent such atrocity from happening. So I will discuss about that. But you know, before, I'm honored to present my organization called We Witness, and I prepared a short clip that you can see what Witness do, you know, especially in terms of citizen action. What you as an individual, what action can you take to prevent an atrocity from happening? So let's watch some, you know, one short clip about that.
Truth behind this. The crime was to have been born. This is Bore. Bore captured the cruelty of forced evictions in Cambodia, where the government has bulldozed and destroyed entire communities for profit. As thousands of people continue to fight for their homes, Bore exposes the truth behind their struggles. Meet Bukeni. Bukeni filmed children as young as 8 years old who were robbed of their childhoods and forced to become soldiers in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Bukeni's footage and advocacy helped convict militia leader Thomas Lubanga of war crimes. Lubanga is now behind bars. This is Laura. Laura helped expose the mass killings and disappearances of Mexican women and girls, whose only crime was to have been born female. Laura's story of one woman forced authorities to recognize widespread violence and to work towards a day when women don't just disappear. Mary first picked up a camera at age 60. She interviewed older men and women who suffered abuse, neglect, and exploitation, and put faces and voices to a silent crisis. Mary's interviews helped pass landmark legislation to protect vulnerable older Americans. Raja supports citizens and journalists in the Middle East who put themselves in danger to capture scenes like this one in Syria. Raja connects activists with the resources they need to document the turbulence around them more safely. These activists have turned us all into witnesses. Many risk their lives to share stories. But to honor their courage, we must do more than just witness. Join us to create a global community of activists. Help us fight human rights abuses throughout the world. Help us expose the truth, one video at a time.
All right, I'm sorry again for the glitches. Definitely technology is an issue even back in 1994. Today, we're still struggling. Can you put the PowerPoint, please? Am I going to use this to kind of walk through the slides? Is that the right or? Okay. Cool. Yeah, I think. Okay, cool. So, that witness, I think, those few activists that were shown in the promo video earlier are the types of work that Witness does to empower people, individual organizations, to really use video to expose human rights violations and to demand for accountability and justice, of course. We Witness has been around for nearly 20 years, working throughout the world on different issues, empowering activists to document stories of abuses and also use those stories as tool for advocacy. Today, I'll talk briefly about the documentation. And then how you, after documenting, how you share that and mobilize for action and also follow up. I think, what we have been hearing throughout the day is that everybody can take action. And of course, we can take action because it is a moral duty that we have as we face atrocities as they are happening. But also, in order to take action, you need a catalyst for action. And that means you need to define what you want, what action you want, and also to plan for that action that you need the audience to really take. The documentation is very, very crucial. And I think, several panelists today try to navigate between, could we have the information at the time of the genocide in Rwanda, or the massacre, or the massacre in Burundi, or the shyly called genocide or mass atrocities in the Congo? Could we be able to take action, and what action would that be? And that means we as citizens, we as activists, to document for a purpose becomes a key. And you document for many reasons, which include evidence, of course, let alone, international, tribunals or justice institutions. We have seen, times and time how the evidence is playing crucial role into the accountability process, but also for story, for record, for archiving, because these stories may not die. Because if we're talking about the genocide in Rwanda to today, of course we were not there, but we can see how the memories are coming. And the way we can see this memory through the film that was shown earlier on, you can see the importance of archiving for history. And also advocacy, which can be throughout many audiences, depending how you target them. But, you document for advocacy because you want to make sure the pieces, the materials that you are documenting can be used to change. Because ultimately, as an activist, as a citizen, the ultimate goal I have, or we should have, is to change. And that can be change in whatever may be practices or laws or policies that the change we are seeking. And if you document better, you may want to plan for that. but also awareness raising. Of course, today we live in a world where we have access to these great tools, including, the internet, the videos, the Twitter, the social media, everything is available. But these tools can help us raise awareness on some very issues that are happening. But also for the media, of course, we have access now to big corporations, whatever it's, from BBC to very small local stations, wherever they are around the world, where people can access, this kind of mainstream media. To access information through this mainstream media. But this is why the documentation become very key. But as we... Okay. But as we talk about the documentation, what is key? The key here is to have the skills to do that better. Of course, if you ask my grandma how she can document, how she can film with a cell phone, of course she would love to, but she doesn't know how to do it. So the skills becomes very key to ensure a proper documentation, though we can have access as well. And it has to be more rapidly because we live in a world where we can access these technologies, cell phones, through other, mobile devices or any devices, but it has to be done very quickly because of, security concerns and other issues that may arise and that may prevent you from, or is going faster as I preview. I don't know where I'm clicking now. Okay. Oh boy. Pardon? I can do it myself. Okay, go back. I don't know what's going on with this remote control. As we can do that very rapidly, but we need tools. And today, we can access as many tools as we can. The cell phones can do better. Of course, back in 1994 or 1993, or, earlier in 1996 with the war in the Congo, these regional wars did not have chance to get access to those tools that activists could use to kind of document properly and then and then reach some of the goals, which include how you ensure accountability through the documentation that you do, or advocacy or awareness raising. But that's not a justification of why this should not be prevented. But also the other important thing that we need to think is, after you have documented, after you have gathered all the information that you need, you have access to this tool, from mobile camera to cell phone to proper equipment, wherever it can be, any mobile recording that you may have access to, or any professional equipment that may have access to. Then the questions become, how do I share that? To whom, if I need to reach this greater audience? We have learned that the UN did effectively know that genocide was occurring in Rwanda. They have the full information. Everybody knew what was happening in Burundi, and even today, we all know what is happening in the Congo. But as an activist, the question is, then how do I share this? How do I reach these greater audiences? And here is where, we can use online. Today is very easy to film through your cell phone, and then at the same time, you can share your media through Twitter or Facebook or whatever after you have made in a YouTube link. So we have greater access today to this technology that we don't have any excuse from not doing something. And this is one of the moral responsibilities that we have. It is a great advantage to have these skills, to have these tools, but also we have to do much better to really have the skills to use these tools better, and then share it, and then see what outcome we can get out there. My PowerPoint has disappeared, which is not a big deal. But also, after you have shared, you have to bear in mind one issue. Is that sharing online is often good, but the problem is, when you put something online, you lose control of it. So the safety and security of your media becomes a problem. Of course, you can also do an offline sharing. How do you make sure people can at least see what is happening somewhere, even though they don't have access online? So these are kind of tactics or strategies that activists often use to share what is happening, to share this information outside the mainstream media, because these have big mouths, but activists too can actually do much better to share or to spread any information about what is happening, to make sure everybody can take some kind of responsibility. As we said, the truth-seeking or accountability through justice institutions, whether it is local or domestic or regional or international, will need your media, of course. Of course, I spoke about the tools. Of course, today one of the tools that's very widespread is the cell phone. I think this is pretty much very common, very accessible, and this is one of the tools that can be used to document atrocities as they occur. The question about mobilizing for action, which is very key, is now the strategy. How do I mobilize? How do I make sure I reach to that audience to make sure an action is taken? Whether it is a local or international or key decision makers, it depends on how you identify your audience and how you expect an action to be taken to really bring the change that you are looking for. But we also understand there are so many challenges. And, few of them that I have highlighted there quickly is the access to technology. Of course, the mobile phone can be a good tool, but not every cell phone can film. So which is another issue still. And not any, cell phone can do whatever you want to do. So though we can have some access, but also it is still challenging. But also this access to technology tells us about how unbalanced this access is. If you imagine someone who is in northern South Sudan in the Kordofan cannot have same access as someone who is in Virginia. So this unbalanced access to technology is also a key challenge when we think about how you better document atrocities as they are occurring. But also, it all depends on a political will that is in the hands of few people. And I think, my direct previous speaker talked about, how sometimes ineffective these sanctions are. Because later on, if you're familiar with the game at the Security Council, so you can understand how difficult it is to get something done, even if it is true, even if it is very needed, even if it is important. The UN itself, I'm sure, for people who took the decisions to withdraw the kind of blue helmet from Rwanda when the situation, of genocide was occurring, they couldn't say they didn't have information, but it was a decision. They could not act at that very moment when it was needed. Because of it was an issue with the political will. That doesn't mean we have to be actually desperate or to discourage us. But the other challenge is the safety and security. Very often when you are in the midst of these atrocities, sometimes you think of yourself. What do I choose to get killed with the bombing while I want to document what is happening, or save myself first? And it makes sense to save yourself. But this is one of the challenges as we think about how you document better, to maybe use your documentation for an action, but also safety and security becomes key. Not only for you, but also for the people who will be included in your media, because they can be targeted because of the issue of censorship. But also safety and security means the ethics. As I work on issues like gender-based violence, you can see how when we're trying to document story of rape, sometimes, documenters lose that aspect of ethics, how you respect the victim even though you want to get her story. How you make sure you do not re-victimize the victim, the person who is already victim. So all of these aspects are things that we often see, and these are really one of the big challenges as we think about documentation. So in conclusion, I think it is great to think about what happened in the past, but the call for action isn't ending by just gathering. It is about us thinking, what can I do to prevent something such what happened in Rwanda from happening again somewhere else. Maybe not necessarily in Rwanda, but maybe in my own community. We live in a world where mass atrocities are occurring pretty much in many places. Whether it is in a war situation, in non-conflict situation, in many places these situations are living with us, but I think we are doing less to prevent, though we are very well equipped with skills and knowledge and all the information and the technology that we need. So it is us, as I'm ending this, with a call to really continue doing much more that we can do, and do not really underestimate the power of one individual can do. As it says in the witness video, that each and every story is a powerful tool for advocacy, and each individual can do something. Those who have done something, they didn't have any magic. They didn't have power that we don't have. They were not stronger than we are, but they were able to do something. So it is a call for us to take some sort of responsibility, even in our own community, to do something to prevent atrocity or genocide or any wrongdoing from happening. So I thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Bukini. I'm wondering, to start us off, and please let me know if you all have questions, but I wonder if you can tell us a little about your story, how you began to document it, what pushed you to do that, and then how that was used for movement building, or what was it used for? Because we heard a little bit, but
yeah, sure.
we would love to hear.
Sure. I think, I happened to be in a situation where the war in the Congo was happening, and I was seeing, kids being recruited and taken to be used as soldiers, both girls and boys at very young age of, 7 to 15. So I was so ambitious. I didn't think after finishing, after completing my master's and my bachelor's degree, I could do some of the charity. But I went on to try to do something because I was seeing what was happening was wrong. So I went on to, trying to use whatever it takes to at least, film or, document some of the stories. I didn't have cell phone, camera at the time. I wasn't trained to film, but I happened to contact a camera person who used to film, the wedding ceremonies and those kind of events, and borrow camera, went to the camp, and then tried to film some of the story, and then I exposed those stories to some of the audiences that had some responsibility to protect, and that pretty much led me into a 12 to 15 years career to try to really seek justice, because though you can help bring back that child who was taken by the militias, but that isn't enough. It wasn't enough to just bring back these kids. There was need for accountability, because this was one of the widespread war crime that was happening in Eastern Congo. So I happened to work with the International Criminal Court to try to make sure some of these perpetrators can be brought to book. Fortunately, many years later, one of the warlords was sentenced for using child soldiers. Well, whether this was a victory, I don't know, but it was it was a good step in the right direction, because then you have to make sure this can be a kind of this can set up a preventive mechanism that will protect even more children from being recruited. So that's pretty much, in short. It's so hard to tell my story by myself, in 5 minutes or 3 minutes, but this is, in summary, what happened.
Thank you. No, do you have, Drew, if you have questions, you can come up to the microphone, because we're recording, and the only way we can get your voice is if you speak into the microphone. Thanks.
Thank you for coming to speak to us today. My question is just about, in light of how effective these personal stories can be for advocacy and how effective the fact-finding is, what do you think of governments that are trying to shut down internet access in the events of genocides like these? And also, we've seen a lot in the Middle East, more autocratic governments will try and exercise really good control, really tight control over events like Tahrir Square, where they limited cell phone usage. Can you talk to us, about your opinion of those events, and then also more about the offline distribution aspect of Witness?
Yeah. Thank you so much for your questions. Let me go, start with the second one in terms of offline distribution. I think this is one of the effective ways to convey, a message or to share the media or the materials that someone has. Because often when we try to reach out an audience, sometimes there is a need for interaction. And you can think of some of the areas where, there is no online access where you can chat via Facebook, via Twitter, but still people who can take action in terms of mobilizing a community. The screening itself might not be enough because people want more to learn more in terms of details. This is where an offline distribution to engage the community, which is a key here to to trigger an action from your audience becomes key. Because very often in these places, whether you can send that media through online, but your audience may also need some interaction, some more engagement. Even if you send your video to the senator, unless there is a wide mobilization, the senator may kind of keep quiet and, be like he didn't see anything. So that direct in-person engagement becomes key because it triggers some kind of information. It comes of, it triggers this interaction and can really bring up some kind of hidden details that you may want that your audience should know. In terms of censorship, this is pretty much what we live with because not everybody likes the truth. The truth isn't a good thing for everyone. Many people often do not want things to be known. And you can see this censorship being used as a political strategy to shut down, say it is an action. Because you could have seen what happened in the Arab Revolution, let's say for example, in the Egyptian Revolution, see how the social media played role, or even in Turkey. So in those places where people have access to internet, have access online, the communication between citizens, because it can lead to an action, becomes a threat to the governing authorities. Just because they don't want some of the truth, they don't want people to take action. And that becomes a key tool for them to really make sure people aren't able to communicate, because this communication is the one that can bring an action. And that is where the threat becomes. But that should not really discourage activists from continuing to do more, because people are very creative. They can still find ways to really, to really find new ways to communicate, though the internet space is shut down. But it is a threat that, is being used by by some decision makers as a tool to shut down any communication, because they are afraid of the truth, because they are afraid of mass mobilization, and because they don't want people to know the truth.
I have another question for you. Numerous speakers on the technology panel talked about validating information, validating data, validating video. Can you talk to us about what Witness does to validate, or what you did to validate video for courts, for other audiences?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. Of course, I didn't expect it, which is great. I think when you kind of create your media or your content or your documentation, I think key questions here usually are raised with the audience that will use your documentation. Is that how credible your documentation or your media is? How can I verify that? And then also, how can I authenticate that? So these are kind of various questions that arise when you are submitting your evidence, to a court or to a tribunal. How your media will, meet some criteria in order to be accepted. So these are kind of key questions that come, and when you are in this process of documenting, these are questions that very often you have to kind of think of. And in terms of witness, of course, we have what we call the Human Rights Channel on YouTube, where we see massive, videos coming from YouTube, and we work with an organization called StoryCorps to verify some of those videos, to make sure they are authentic, to make sure this video, the source is really credible. And this is pretty much, it's not like we have our internal expertise, but we rely on other sources to really make this happen. But also, very recently, we have worked with with an organization called the Guardian Project, where we are trying to develop what we call the InformaCam. And this InformaCam has a purpose to document an evidence, to make sure you can, through your metadata, you can identify, the location, the time, to kind of identify, a kind of a very good GPS, and to make sure you can have a kind of reliable materials that can be used in any instances, wherever, whether it is for, a court or a tribunal, or for media, for example, that may want to release something that can be verifiable. So a good metadata can really ensure that your materials or your documentation can really be accepted by an audience that can use it for accountability or for any purpose that you envision.
Great. Are there other questions from the audience? Any other questions? No? Okay, well, thank you so much. It was so wonderful to have you here, and thank you again for coming from so far.
Okay.
And for being patient with us throughout the day for the technology issues. So thank you, everybody. I'll just wrap it up. I think that I want to thank our Student Advisory Board for organizing this day of commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda. Some of you are here. I thanked you earlier, but I want to thank you again for your energy and time. I also want to thank our speakers again. I think that it shows a lot that that many of you were here the whole day and stuck through all of our technology issues to commemorate this important day. And I think it was a great discussion. I wish we had time to continue all of these discussions, whether it was corporate enablers, the use of technology, citizen action. I think we could have whole day-long conversations, conferences, papers on each of it, but I think we touched on a little of it in this very unique way. So thank you all again, and we look forward to hopefully we'll commemorate the Rwandan genocide in 10 more years, but hopefully we won't have to have other sorts of commemorations like this. But forever the people of Rwanda will be in our minds, the survivors and those who also were killed. So thank you, everybody.